is authorized to declare recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and the House Rule 11. The chair announces that she may postpone roll call votes. Today, the committee is meeting virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this meeting. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the meeting. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted until you are speaking. Finally, if members have documents they wish to submit to the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the meeting. Pursuant to notice, the committee meets to consider the following measures. H.R.5781, the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act. H.R.1437, the Providing Research and Estimates of Changes in Precipitation as a PRECIP Act. And H.R.5324, the NWR Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2021. Let me welcome everyone to today's markup of these bills that address critical issues facing our nation. First, we will consider H.R. 5781, the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act. I want to thank Representative Lofgren for introducing this common sense bill. And I also want to thank our colleagues, Representative Bonamici, Mr. McNerney, and Mr. Perlmutter, for joining Representative Lofgren in introducing this bill. This bill builds on the strength of our federal science agencies to better address the growing threat of wildland fires across our country. Our cutting-edge federal research and operational programs provide crucial support to the first responders. These first responders are on the front lines battling the intense wildland fires in what has become a seemingly year-round fire season. H.R. 5781 will strengthen federal coordination of research and operational efforts across multiple science agencies. The legislation will support a more efficient and effective whole-of-government response to reducing wildland fire risk through federal coordination and collaboration. This is a good bill, and I am proud to co-sponsor it. Next, we will consider bipartisan legislation introduced by the Environmental Subcommittee Chair, Ms. Sherrill, H.R. 1437, the PRECIP Act. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill, along with full committee ranking member Lucas and Environmental Subcommittee ranking member Bice. I appreciate Chairwoman Sherrill's leadership on this committee on issues related to heavy precipitation and flooding. These types of extreme weather events are becoming more intense due to climate change and impacting communities across the country. We saw the effects in Texas during the Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And unfortunately, we saw the deadly effects of heavy precipitation earlier this year due to Hurricane Ida. Despite making landfall on the Gulf Coast, Ida dumped water all the way up to New York City and left a path of devastation in its wake. NWR has a responsibility to provide the most accurate and up-to-date precipitation data. The updates that are authorized in this bill will be critical to preparing our cities and our communities for future extreme weather. Last, we will consider another bipartisan bill led by the Environmental Subcommittee, ranking member Bice, and co-sponsored by Chairwoman Sherrill. The NWR Weather Radio Modernization Act would help to upgrade and modernize NWR Weather Radio. NWR Weather Radio provides critical weather information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Additionally, NOAA Weather Radio supports the broadcasting of public safety alerts and warnings for other natural hazards. This bill would provide authorization to update, modernize, and in some cases expand the current NOAA Weather Radio program. This modernization will improve NOAA's current broadcast delivery and help this critical program better reach underserved communities. I want to thank the members for their interest in these bills, and I look forward to a productive markup. I now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This morning, we're considering 3 bills, and I wish I could say that all of the bills under consideration were bipartisan, but unfortunately, I cannot. Over the last 3 years, we've worked together on the Science Committee to produce thoughtful, consensus legislation to advance the competitiveness of the United States and to address national goals. We've been deliberate and collaborative in drafting our legislation. Since I became a ranking member, I've made it a priority to return this committee to an atmosphere of mutual respect where we can work together to achieve our shared goals. My friend Chairwoman Johnson has been a tremendous partner in this effort, and I think our results speak for themselves. We've passed dozens of bipartisan bills on research and development, conservation, STEM education, advanced technologies. Last year, we passed the first comprehensive update of our energy policy in more than a decade. This year, we developed landmark R&D bills to double our basic research investments at NSF, DOE, and NIST. This kind of valuable legislation doesn't always make the most headlines, but it makes a real difference. We're able to do this because we don't operate like other committees. And while we may not be able to reconcile our differences on every bill that we consider, we aren't trying to score political points against each other. 2 of the 3 bills on the agenda today are truly bipartisan committee products that have been through our usual collaborative process, with committee staff working across the aisle and alongside all members of this committee to develop good proposals. The PRECIP Act and the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act are thoughtful bills which have been informed by stakeholder feedback and involved extensive discussions and negotiations between our staff. I'll discuss those bills more when they're brought up for consideration. Unfortunately, the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act has not been through that process. Wildfires are a critical issue in the West and Midwest. Members on both sides of the aisle want to do productive work to mitigate their damage. So this could have been a productive and bipartisan bill. Instead, the bill was developed behind closed doors with little input from Republicans on the committee. The behind-the-scenes partisanship on this bill was unnecessary, unprecedented, and counterproductive to a healthy legislative environment at this committee. Instead of working together, Republican staff weren't given the bill draft text until just days before it was introduced. We were given little opportunity to provide input or improve ahead of the time. So that's why we'll be offering a number of amendments today. The process didn't have to be this way. Wildfires know no political boundaries. I can't think of a more pressing issue for members in the West. I would have thought an issue like this could rise above politics. It would be addressing preventing and reducing wildfires, saving lives and property. For instance, California Representative Mike Garcia has been a leader on this issue on our committee, a member with a district deeply impacted by wildland fires and a prime example of the urban wildland interface. He introduced a bipartisan bill in August, the Fire Information and Reaction Enhancement Act, or the FIRE Act. His legislation improves NOAA's wildfire forecasting capacities and was developed with input from NOAA and the support of numerous stakeholders. It has bipartisan support, and a number of Democrats have co-sponsored it. It's unfortunate that this bill could not have been incorporated into legislation today, but the gentleman will offer an amendment to do so later in the markup. Now, I understand that this partisanship, I should say, is typical for some committees in Congress, but I believe the Science Committee can and should be better than that. Members like serving on the Science Committee because we're the fun committee. tackling the problems of the future. Let's not lose sight of our committee's mission to harness innovation to improve the lives of all Americans. So, that all being said, today's markup is going to take a little longer than it should have. We have a number of members offering thoughtful, productive amendments to try and improve the underlying legislation. We'll get through today's markup, and then I look forward, hopefully, moving ahead for the rest of the Congress together to advance science and technology. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your remarks. We will now consider H.R. 5781, the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5781, a bill to improve the federal effort to reduce wildland fires.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendments at any point. Does anyone wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill? The chair recognizes Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this markup and for your continued leadership in harnessing the full range of our federal science agencies to best serve the American people. I also want to recognize the work of the co-leads, Representative McNerney, Bonamici, and Perlmutter, for their efforts promoting the policies in this bill as members representing states impacted by record-setting fires. And importantly, I'd like to thank all the staff who worked with me to develop this legislation. As you've noted, wildfires are becoming increasingly devastating. More and more parts of the nation are turning into high-risk fire zones, and the wildfire seasons are now nearly year-long. 2020 was the most active wildfire season on record, with 10.3 million acres burned and direct damage totaling about $20 billion. Now, while dealing with more severe wildfires over the few years, we've learned that suppression and forest management alone, while crucial, are insufficient without science-based mitigation strategies. This bill is meant to supplement existing efforts at our land management agencies. The challenge of wildfires is multifaceted and requires a whole-of-government approach, and it's time for the federal government to start treating wildfires more like other major disasters, such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, by making sustained investments in wildfire science. The bill is a comprehensive authorization bill meant to bring all of the federal government's scientific resources to bear to prevent loss of life and property. It would identify and invest in R&D, set up warning and forecast systems, develop observation sensing technologies, and standardize data collection efforts. It would increase our country's ability to anticipate, detect, monitor, and contain fires, which is so largely dependent on the scientific information available, as well as the accessibility of that information, and would establish an interagency coordinating committee on wildlife fire risk reduction. We have begun to demonstrate that we're getting serious about the wildfire crisis. The recently signed Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act included funding to increase federal firefighters' salaries, use GOES, the satellites, and provide detection and real-time monitoring equipment, and more. The Build Better Act, which we will soon consider in the floor, includes funding for research on the impact of fires, hazardous fuels mitigation, and PFAS-free firefighting equipment. The policies in this bill will provide a united federal agenda on wildfires using science-based and cost-effective measures. I just would like to make one note on the drafting of the bill. We spent over a year working to draft this bill, and I want to make sure that everyone knows that my staff and the majority staff made it a point to include the minority staff in all briefings with the federal agencies. We shared the draft with the minority as soon as we had it. We sent the ANS to the Republicans on November 5th, 11 days ago, and several days before we noticed the markup, and we've welcomed their input. We have, we did approach the ranking member to be a co-lead, and I realize that this has been a quick process once the draft was done, but there was certainly no intent to exclude the minority, far from it. And in fact, we've been working with Republican members the last few days to see if we can come together with various amendments that are being offered. And I welcome that opportunity. So I just wanted to make sure that we cleared the air on that point. And I certainly have valued working with the ranking member on the committee and want him to know that. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Anyone else seeking time?
I seek time, Madam Chairwoman. Suzanne Bonamici.
Okay. You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and speak in support of the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act.
The gentlelady has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. In the past 3 decades, the United States has sustained more than 300 weather disasters, and that includes 19 severe wildfire events that cost more than $100 billion in damages, and which caused nearly 400 deaths. Climate change has increased the intensity of severe fire events. Since 2000, annual fires have burned on average 7 million acres. That's double the total acreage burned in the 1990s. And wildfires not only destroy property and lives, but they also contribute to degraded air quality and harm threatened and endangered species. And we saw this certainly in Oregon over the last couple of years. And in Oregon, for example, we saw crops damaged by smoke, affecting the bottom line for the agriculture sector. And the scope and scale of wildfires creates challenges for fire departments and emergency medical responders who are constrained by limited resources and oftentimes inadequate staffing. The escalating threat of wildfires demands an aggressive whole of government response. The National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act will help meet this need by establishing an interagency coordinating committee on wildland fire risk reduction. The committee will help oversee and align the federal government's response to wildfire prediction, prevention, and mitigation, all important. The bill provides agencies, including the Department of Energy, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Environmental Protection Agency, with the authority to build out their current work on wildland fires, which in turn will improve our understanding of wildfires, expand our forecasting warning systems, enhance data collection efforts, and also grow our nation's overall resilience to wildfires. I want to thank my colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, for her leadership on this issue. I also align myself with her comments about the opportunity to make this bill bipartisan. I also have appreciated the opportunity to work with Mr. Lucas and other Republicans on the committee over the years. I'm hopeful that this process today will end up with a bipartisan piece of legislation because, as Mr. Lucas said, wildfires don't know political parties. They can happen anywhere. So I, again, look forward to working with all of you on this important piece of legislation. And I urge my colleagues to support the legislation and thoughtfully consider the amendments that are offered. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time?
Mr. Garcia.
Mr. Garcia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I move to strike the last word. Like Mr. Lucas, I appreciate the intent of the underlying bill, and I believe that this is an issue where there's a great deal of bipartisan agreement. Unfortunately, I think in this case, politics and pride have gotten in the way of a good policy. In my time on this committee, I've always been impressed by the congenial and bipartisan nature in which we're all able to work. And it's in this spirit that this committee has passed many important measures to improve the scientific capabilities of the federal government, including 2 today. In stark contrast to those 2 and our previous experiences, this very partisanship bill has broken with tradition and has refused to negotiate in good faith with the other side, unfortunately. And I think this is a shame. It's clear that steps must be taken to improve our observation, forecast, capabilities, early intervention, and prevention of wildland fires. And many of our science agencies already possess the groundwork to provide meaningful data and knowledge to improve the decision-making of federal and non-federal land managers nationwide. If we harness our scientific communities and focus them on the right areas, we can reduce the incidence and severity of fires in this country, which makes it all the more sad that this blatant partisanship has gotten in the way of these meaningful efforts. And let's be clear, this is not a comprehensive fire bill, as my colleague from California asserted in her opening comments. It does not include key agencies such as the Department of Interior, U.S. Forest Service, and other federal land management agencies that are very critical in these conversations to include in something that is meaningful and as large as this, without including the actual firefighters and working to improve their decision-making capability and the ability of land managers to conduct actual forest management activities. This cannot be deemed a comprehensive fire bill. Outside of DC, my state, my district is suffering from the terrible impacts of wildfires, and the same is true for many of the folks here who represent states in the West. And we shouldn't allow the swampy politics and an unwillingness to work with our colleagues on other committees to derail the improving the lives of our constituents. I'll offer a number of amendments today that I believe would improve the bill, including a version of my own bipartisan bill that Mr. Lucas spoke of in his intro remarks to improve wildfire capabilities at NOAA. And it's my hope that my colleagues on the other side will return to the bipartisan partnership that has made this committee so successful. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time?
Madam Chair, I'd like to move to strike the last word.
Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thank you very much. And I'm proud to work with Representative Lofgren, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. McNerney in putting this bill together. In 2020, Colorado had the 3 largest wildfires in our state's history, setting a record for the worst wildfire season we have ever experienced. And 2021 has been a quiet wildfire season until today, when a wildfire has sprung up near Rocky Mountain National Park. This year, Colorado experienced, unlike last year, but now we've got wildfires this year, Colorado experienced mudslides from last year's fires and poor air quality from wildfires in neighboring states. The Denver area went from having one of the best air qualities in the country and in the world in May and June to one of the worst in the world when the traveling smoke from the California and Oregon wildfires migrated to Colorado. We don't know a lot about wildfires, their behavior, and their long-lasting effects. The National Wildfire Fire Risk Reduction Program will improve our understanding of wildfires and create a more coordinated, whole-of-government approach so we can better prepare for and respond to these worsening threats. Close to half of my state's population lives in or near places prone to wildfires, so we need to get serious about our approach to wildfires to protect people's lives, their homes, and our natural resources. I urge all my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any other requests for time?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Congresswoman Ross.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just moved to strike the last word. Thank you for the recognition. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. And I'm also a proud co-sponsor of the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act. The bill that we're discussing today, along with others, make important investments to ensure Americans have the necessary information to prepare for extreme weather events. This bill leverages the considerable expertise of our nation's scientific agencies to mitigate the impacts of wildfires. More than 4.8 million people in North Carolina, or 50% of North Carolina's population, are living in areas at elevated risk of wildfire. The negative impacts of wildfires linger far after the flames have been extinguished. Smoke particles in the air can cause asthma attacks, breathing problems, and worsen the effects of heart disease. We cannot continue to fight extreme weather in a piecemeal fashion. It requires a whole of government approach that uses robust data and cutting-edge technology to respond to wildfires. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time? We will now then proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Is somebody request?
McNerney.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. McNerney requested time.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I move to strike the last word. So I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 5781. Wildfire remains a persistent threat throughout California, with each year, as you've heard, breaking new records for destruction. It seems like every year we have worse fires. 15 or 20 years ago, we'd hear of a fire once in a while, we'd see some smoke, but lately it's every single year. My district has among the worst air quality in the country, but it gets even worse during wildfires. Smoke events have triggered air quality alerts and aggravating health conditions. My constituents and residents across California have to be prepared for emergency evacuations in case of advancing firefighters and in case of electric utilities go down. What was once considered a seasonal threat has now become a perennial danger. Over the last few years, large fires have burned well into December, the height of the wet season. In 2020 alone, almost 4.4 million acres of land burned in the state of California. These fires have destroyed communities, created public health hazards, impaired the delivery of electricity, and mangled the forests that protect our freshwater supplies. They also have led to loss of life. And although the fires are burning in the western United States, the impacts reverberate across the entire country. Plumes of smoke can blow thousands of miles across the country and create dangerous air conditions across to the East Coast. This past July, observations from NOAA, the Global Systems Laboratory, showed high concentrations of PM 2.5 across every state in the country because of fires burning in a few of our western states. In a study published last month in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, researchers found that climate change is now the main driver of the atmospheric conditions fueling more destructive wildfires. Record-setting drought conditions have also made forests more prone to wildfires. These findings indicate that the problem will only get worse, and it's due time to improve our federal research, development, and response to wildfires. If enacted, the legislation would establish a coordinated program to reduce wildfire land risk, similar to what has already exists for earthquakes. This includes a new interagency coordinating committee co-chaired by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In addition to creating a strategic plan that will guide interagency work, the bill would create directives for federal agencies to improve R&D and basic sciences on Earth observation data, fire risk prediction, modeling and forecasting of fire, weather, and behavior, building materials, codes, and retrofits, energy infrastructure resilience, and the public health impacts of wildfire smoke. The work across several federal agencies will ensure that the government is building a comprehensive understanding of wildfire zones and that the research is building on work already being completed across these silos. California and the rest of our Western neighbors cannot afford to have more years of increasingly destructive wildfires. We need to increase investment in avoidance, minimization, mitigation of wildfires, as well as accurate forecasting and messaging to reduce damage when fires do occur. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other further requests for time?
Madam Chair, Congressman Baird, I just have a quick question.
You recognized.
Thank you. I'm just, where did the figures, I understand this bill is going to cost about $4.4 billion. I'm not against that because I think research and basic science is extremely important. But can you give me some idea where these figures came from? Did each agency like NIST and NSF and so on make their estimates as to what they thought they needed to accomplish this goal?
Yeah, one moment. Is the policy staff present?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if the gentlelady would yield to me, since as the author of the bill, we got the cost estimates from each of the agencies that were impacted, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Well, thank you.
And I thank you. That's the question I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed with the amendments and that are listed in order on the roster. The first amendment, Ms. Lofgren is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. This is an amendment in the nature of a substitute. It was developed to incorporate input from agencies, institutions, departments, and first responders who will be directly involved in wildfire detection, mitigation, and suppression. Stakeholder feedback emphasized the need to amend the underlying bill text to ensure that efforts were not duplicative and also to leverage existing federal government efforts. The ANS accordingly includes more language directing interagency coordination and collaboration and clarifies the data management and collaboration language to ensure efficiency. When addressing the threat of wildfires, the wildland urban interface is a crucial component. However, the feedback indicated the need to update the definition to be more inclusive of vulnerable lands. Therefore, the ANS directs the Interagency Coordinating Committee to develop a nationally recognized consensus-based definition of the wildland urban interface that will better address the needs of all of our communities. It also ensures that scientific research addresses the full range of wildland fire impacts, including impacts on ecosystems, and requires consideration of social science in the R&D activities conducted at NOAA to help better communicate fire risk information to communities. It updates the FEMA section so the management of all program activities goes through the U.S. Fire Administration and expands the activities that will be carried out. Specific activities added include directing FEMA to operate a technical assistance program for local, state, and tribal governments, integrating fire data with the agency's existing hazard risk and mitigation data and analyses, and helping with the development of a wildland fire risk hazard map. It also recognizes the potential contributions of commercial data, as well as partnerships with industry, academia, and nonprofit entities on relevant items, such as technologies that could contribute to wildfire risk reduction. It also emphasizes the translation of research into applications and facilitates the communication and dissemination of data to stakeholders. Finally, the ANS makes a number of technical changes throughout the bill. I want to thank all of those on both sides of the aisle who took time to engage with us and to provide feedback to better inform the bill. I would like to note the comment that the bill is not comprehensive is really misses the point. This is comprehensive in addressing the scientific community and covers NOAA, NASA, NIST, and the National Science Foundation. The bill is to fill the gap in the federal response. And I know some members are new to the Congress and the committee, but we have jurisdiction over what we have jurisdiction over. The bill was purposely drafted to keep the focus on the jurisdiction of the Science Committee. There are many efforts that many of us have pushed in other committee jurisdictions as it relates to FEMA's response and aid to impacted communities and the federal wildland firefighting workforce. I'd note that we did get additional funding for firefighters in the appropriations bill, but that's not within the jurisdiction of the Science Committee. This closes the gap on the science side of those portions of the government that are within the jurisdiction of the Science Committee. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much. I skipped an important portion. I did not call on the clerk to report the amendment. Madam Clerk, if you will report it, we will announce that it's been previously spoken to.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objections, so ordered, and recognize that the gentlelady has spoken to it. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Letourneau. Mr. Letourneau.
Mr. Letourneau.
Mr. Lucas wants to be recognized, but he got disconnected.
Oh, we have a disconnect to this. Anyone else seeking to? Oh, Mr. Letourneau, you're back. Were you seeking recognition? You're on mute.
Mr. Letourneau, you're muted.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wasn't seeking recognition. My apologies.
Okay. Anyone are there any other?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Frank Lucas, please, seeking recognition.
You recognize the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Johnson. I appreciate that this amendment in the nature of substitute makes some improvements to the underlying bill, but I have to oppose it. We wouldn't be in this position if the bill's sponsor had chosen a different path with such an important issue. We could have worked together across the aisle as our committee usually does. We would have been able to make key improvements to this bill. Republican staff started reviewing the draft and identifying Representative Garcia as a potential lead for this bill, given his prior leadership on this issue. But the bill's sponsor refused to work with our member. Representative Garcia's bill has bipartisan support and is co-sponsored by 4 Democrats, all from California. It also has bicameral support with a bipartisan companion bill in the United States Senate. This wasn't a dispute over policy, but it might better be described instead as and I wish I didn't have to say this, a petty and vindictive partisan response that's way out of bounds for this committee. If we'd been given the chance to provide real input, we could have made a much better bill. For instance, we could have done more to improve NOAA's forecasting abilities, which would have given us more warning to better prepare for and fight wildland fires. We could have provided for commercial data buys, which would significantly expand our access to satellite monitoring of wildfires. We could have improved how the Department of Energy coordinates with utilities to improve situational awareness about wildfires that could impact the grid. And we could have created an integrated fire center for better coordination responses across federal agencies. But because we were not given the chance to provide that input, Republicans will be offering amendments this morning to address all the gaps in this legislation. The most troubling gap, of course, is the fact that this bill completely excludes coordination with the Department of Interior and the Forestry Service. Now, I understand the desire to avoid jurisdictional issues, but it's foolish to think we can address this issue without involving the 2 agencies with the biggest roles in preventing, mitigating, and fighting wildfires. I'm scratching my head about the point of this bill. If it were to make good policy and help folks in the West avoid the risk of wildfires, then the bill sponsor would have incorporated key agencies, taken more time to gather stakeholder feedback, and worked with Republicans to make the strongest bill possible, with the kind of bipartisan momentum that helps pass bills like this. Unfortunately, I'm not sure the goal here is to actually protect lives and property from devastating wildfires. Now, I think the goal may be just to pass a bill which will go nowhere from here. Now, some of my friends then can tell their constituents they've been working on wildfire legislation, even though they know it has no chance of being signed into law. This issue is too important for that kind of political gamesmanship. Wildfires know no political boundaries. I can't think of a more pressing issue for our members in the West. Americans are losing their homes, their histories, and yes, their lives. We had a chance to advance strong bipartisan legislation to coordinate federal research and development to prevent this devastation. I'm incredibly disappointed that instead of doing that, my friends on the other side have chosen to move forward on a rushed, incomplete messaging bill that has no legislative future. That's a shame because there's a lot of potential here. My hope is that we'll have another opportunity to work together across the aisle to take the good elements of this bill, and there are many, and build it out into solid legislation. Until then, I will be voting against this A&S, and I've told my members to proceed as they see fit. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Is there any further requests for time?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Perlmutter, just move to strike the last word.
You'll recognize Mr. Perlmutter.
Just a couple questions for Mr. Lucas. Did you say that all the co-sponsors were from California? I think you did. And I'd have to differ with you on that. I'm from Colorado. Ms. Bonamici is from Oregon. And we both have states that face tremendous wildfire pressure. We believe that this bill is timely and it has to get done. So this isn't a California issue. This isn't an Oregon issue. This isn't a Colorado issue. This isn't an Oklahoma issue. This is an issue for America to address. And I appreciate the gentleman's concern that and belief that this is a partisan effort, which I completely disagree with. We've been working on this for a long time, and the gentleman from Oklahoma knows that. So I'm disappointed that even though the gentleman says this amendment really does some positive things, he's still going to vote against it, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I don't know if the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Lofgren, would like me to yield to her, but I'm happy to do that.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I just think it's important to, correct the record here. We did approach Ranking Member Lucas to see if he would join Chairwoman Johnson in co-sponsoring this bill. That was at a staff level. He did suggest that Mr. Garcia might be interested. Mr. Garcia never spoke to me, and his staff never spoke to my staff. His bill, if you want to talk about a messaging bill, his bill is, I think, a bill with no real substance. It doesn't add anything new to the conversation. It is included in our bill with some additional measures. So, if I hadn't seen Representative Garcia and his, in the last year that we have been working on this bill with federal agencies and academics, and we've, if he'd had so many ideas, I wish he had reached out to us directly to our office when we'd had an opportunity. But having a science committee-based measure is not a partisan issue. I think the attitude displayed by the ranking member is, I'm sure, heartfelt, but not as connected with the actual events as it might have been. And I know that I don't want to get into any acrimony here at the committee. I respect Mr. Lucas a great deal.
Ms. Lofgren, let me yield to Mr. Lucas. It looks like he'd like to say something.
Right.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. I think my first point that I was trying to get across was Mr. Garcia has 4 Californians as co-sponsors on his bill. I would also note that the comment was made by the author that you've been working on the draft for a year. We saw it 11 days ago on this side of the room. I would suggest that recruiting every possible Republican who's not on the science committee to be a co-sponsor is not exactly the way to lay the groundwork. I have worked diligently, I think, with the chairman and everyone on the committee for the last now almost 3 years to create a working environment where when we pass legislation, it's able to go to the floor in a suspension calendar. It's perfected and ready to go if there's another vehicle. I've tried hard on that. I must also say, when I was vice chairman of the committee, when we were last in the majority, I listened very, very carefully to then ranking member Johnson's comments on several occasions about how the majority was addressing the minority. I paid very close attention to now Chairwoman Johnson's observations. No matter who is the majority in a year's time, I personally will continue to try and follow the admonishment and the advice the good chair gave when she was the ranking member. That said, we have a number of amendments. Let's work through those and let's see if we can come up with something we can all be supportive of. And with that, I yield back to my dear friend from Colorado.
Lucas, I think my time has expired, but on behalf of Ms. Ross and myself, I can tell you the two of us will work with all of you, Mr. Garcia, when it comes to rules to make sure any other amendments are made in order that are beneficial to this bill. I'll yield back to the chair.
Well, thank you very much. Any additional comments or time requested? If there are no additional comments, we will move to the next amendment and vote on the substitute later. Mr. Obermolte, the next amendment is on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Obermolte. He is recognized to offer his amendment.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr.
Unanimous consent to dispense with the reading and without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me say to the entire committee how delighted I am that the committee is having this discussion. Wildfire is an issue that's extremely important to all of us in the Western United States, but particularly those of us from the state of California. As I would think most everyone on this committee knows, we are experiencing right now the worst wildfire season in the history of our state. Last year had set the record, and this year is purports to be even worse. And that's particularly true in my district. I represent the largest district in California. It's a very rural district, and we absolutely live or die by the wildfire activities in our district. I myself live in a community that's completely surrounded by national forest, and me and my family have been evacuated out of our home 3 times in the time that we've lived there because of the threat of wildfire immediately to our community. Several years ago, I had the very poignant experience of visiting the devastated town of Paradise when the Camp Fire completely destroyed that community. And I can't tell you how heartbreaking it was to talk to the former residents of that town, the mayor of that town, and to think about the fact that, but for the grace of God, that could have been any of the cities that I represent. So this is an extremely important topic, and I'd like to thank everyone for working on this. Obviously, I'm a big believer in the use of science to inform decision-making. And I think that that's the great thing about this bill is that we're funding those activities that are going to inform decision-making when it comes to the activities the federal government performs with respect to wildfires. But I think we're missing one element of that, and that's why I've offered this amendment. We're in the bill as written, we're directing research and development activities towards observation and prediction. But I also think we need to do some research and development on land management practices. The science that has been developed recently overwhelmingly indicates that land management is going to play a very important role in reducing the risk of wildfires, particularly as climate change makes the wildfire environment worse in the Western United States. The data that we have shows that this is possible, that we can use tools like management, tools like reforestation, fuels reduction in ways that is informed by science to reduce this risk. So my amendment adds another activity to this research and development program, and I'll read it. It says, to support research and development activities to improve data, tools, and technologies that directly inform, support, and complement active land management, forest and habitat restoration, and healthy ecosystem practices executed by the U.S. Forest Service and state, local, and tribal entities. So I think this fits in with the bill very well. I think it's completely germane to the bill. This is not funding the land management practices itself. It's funding the research and development science that's going to inform making good land management practices decisions in the states that are directly impacted by these catastrophic wildfires. So with that, I respectfully urge the adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Madam Chairperson,
Chair recognizes Ms. Lofgren.
I'll move to strike the last word. I'd like to thank Congressman Obernolte for his work on this amendment. I think it helps manage our lands and supports the ecosystem in a responsible manner. I want to compliment him on how he has drafted it because he's correct. It maintains, is germane by listing allowable activities and keeping this suggestion and this research within the activity of the Science Committee. So I hope to support this amendment. I hope everyone else does. And I want to thank him for the work that he's done on it. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lucas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. Across the West, more than 10 million acres burned in 2020, a record in modern history. These fires consumed more than 17,500 structures, cost more than $3.5 billion in firefighting efforts. Although several factors contributed to this trend, a significant one is the declining health of the nation's forests. USDA Forestry Service, which manages 193 million acres of land, reports a backlog of 80 million acres in need of restoration and 63 million acres facing high or very high risk of wildfire. As I stated earlier, the most troubling gap in this legislation is the fact the bill completely excludes coordination with the Department of the Interior and Forestry Service. These agencies play the largest role in the federal government, preventing, mitigating, and fighting wildfires. Mr. Obernolte's amendment remedies this error by requiring this new program to support research and development activities that will directly inform, support, and complement active land management, forestry and habitat restoration, and healthy ecosystem practices that are carried out by the Forestry Service, as well as state, local, and tribal entities. I want to thank the gentleman for offering this productive amendment. I strongly urge my colleagues to support it. I'm pleased to hear the author agrees with that, and I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any further requests? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the desk, on the roster, is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. He is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 3, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado. Page 7.
Unanimous consent to consent with the dispense of the reading and without objection, show order. I now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment addresses building resiliency in 2 ways. First, it makes changes to the Interagency Coordinating Committee strategic plan to expand research and development opportunities into how we can better protect buildings from wildfire hazards, as well as promote energy efficiency and environmental sustainability, which will help us tackle the real cause, which is climate change and the drought that we face in the West. My amendment would also expand FEMA's collaboration with other agencies like the Department of Energy on hazard resilience research to protect buildings from wildfires. This research would focus on how we can better retrofit our buildings to make them more fire resistant and protect its occupants. National labs like the National Renewable Energy Lab in my district are already working with DOE's Building Technologies Office to research and perform building simulations to determine the best building code upgrades, whether a building has proper shelter-in-place metrics and the best building design measures to protect against extreme weather events. I have heard my friend from Oklahoma and a couple of his complaints. This addresses at least one of those where we're trying to bring in other agencies to coordinate with them. And to the degree my friend would like to co-sponsor this amendment, I'd be happy to have him. And if he would like to, he could be the lead sponsor on this amendment. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on this amendment?
Chairwoman.
Ms. Lofgren is recognized.
I want to thank Mr. Perlmutter for this amendment as we face, as he says, increasing number of more intense hazard events. It is important to consider an approach that mitigates against the damaging effects of multiple hazard risks without sacrificing our energy and environment-focused goals for buildings and communities. That's a hard problem, and it requires new types of collaboration and new research tools. And I think this amendment encourages just that. I think it improves the bill, and I'm glad he's offering it and intend to support it. I yield back.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. He is recognized to offer his amendment, Mr. Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 4, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Caston.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so order. As the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think I'll need 5 minutes. My amendment asks that no later than a year after the enactment of this act, the coordinating committee shall convene to assess the need for further studies to be conducted by the National Academies of Sciences in an effort to identify interactions between climate change and wildfires. Earlier this month, UCLA researchers found that climate change is responsible for the conditions that are fueling wildfires in the western United States due to vapor pressure deficit. Just last week, of course, I had the pleasure of traveling to Glasgow with you, Madam Chair, and with Representative Bonamici. And one of the many intriguing discussions that we had while we were there was about how to quantify the durability of CO2 sequestration in forests as compared to other approaches in the wake of increasing wildfire risks. And it's this complicated issue, right? We've got a whole lot of countries in the world who are trying to figure out how to use their forests to address this issue. And meanwhile, a lot of those forests are on fire. Now, as that conversation proceeds internationally, I think it behooves us to make sure that we better understand the science in our own domestic forests. To that end, this bill asks for multiple agencies, including NSF, NOAA, NASA, EPA, and Department of Energy, to consider the impact of climate change on wildfires. The amendment would give the coordinating committee the opportunity to define those further research gaps, but they may include questions such as the degree to which climate change increases the risk of wildfire, the degree to which the wildfires themselves are exaggerating or maybe muting those risks, which parts of the United States are at risks of desertification from wildfires, how the frequency of fire risk is changing over time, and try to quantify what management protocols might affect those various wildfire risks. I respectfully ask my colleagues for their continued support of this common sense and rather urgent amendment that would ensure that the coordinating committee can be as effective as possible in their efforts. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chairwoman.
She'll recognize Ms. Lofgren.
I move to strike the last word. I just want to briefly thank Mr. Caston for offering this amendment. As mentioned, it does direct the interagency coordinating committee to assess how the National Academy study could identify areas for further research. And I think it does highlight the importance of considering climate change in the research. I think it's a good amendment. I intend to support it, and I thank him for offering it. I yield back.
Thank you. Any further discussion?
Madam Chairwoman.
Yes. Who is that?
Mr. Obernolte.
Oh, Mr. Obernolte, you're recognized.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I thank the gentleman from Illinois for offering the amendment. I also think it's a good one. It raises the very important question of the effects of climate change on wildfires. And I think scientifically speaking, it's very clear that there is a causal linkage there. But however, I'd like to ask the gentleman a question if he's willing. I'll yield to him, Dr. Caston. From my point of view, a very interesting question is the degree to which wildfires themselves have an impact on climate change. In California, where we've seen all of our efforts at reducing atmospheric carbon emissions more than negated just by the carbon emissions of the sequestration of carbon from wildfires in the last couple of years in California. So I think that it's a very interesting question to say that not only should we research how climate change impacts wildfire severity, we should also research how wildfires impact climate change themselves, because it seems to be a very complicated ecosystem. So I wonder if you might address whether or not your amendment would also catalyze looking into the answer to that question. And I'll yield to you if you're willing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And first, I think I'm pretty sure you're the only one of us with a PhD. I appreciate you calling me doctor, but I'm just a lowly master's student. I think you're absolutely right, and it's these complicated feedback loops, right? And that was part of this conversation we had in Glasgow of saying, you've got countries like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Canada, who would like to use their forests as a way to better manage and mitigate those risks. But when those wildfires catch fire, what happens, right? Now, on the one hand, you've got soot that goes into the atmosphere that cools. How quickly do the trees grow back? Do the trees that grow back, if they do, absorb carbon more quickly because they're younger? There was some interesting analysis in Australia recently that the ash actually, and this probably doesn't matter in California, but when that ash blew to the east and into oceans, actually increased algal growth in oceans because of micronutrients that were suddenly in the oceans. It's complicated stuff, and that's certainly the intent, that the agencies would be able to do a good holistic view so that when we are discussing what role those things might play in our own national contributions to CO2 reduction and getting to where we need to, that we really understand the degree to which forestry management can help or hinder, how durable those carbon sinks are. So you're spot on, and I appreciate your support.
Great. Well, thank you.
The gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
I just want to thank you for raising this issue, because I remember as the fires got into my region of California, and then the smoke, I thought of all the efforts we had made to reduce emissions just went up in smoke. And so I think it's actually covered in this amendment, but you're raising it is very important. I wanted to thank you for that and yield back.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm glad that we're shedding some light on this very important issue, and thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. Madam Chair, I'll yield the balance of my time.
Any further requests for time? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the ranking member, Mr. Lucas, and he's recognized to offer his amendment.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 5, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5.
Consent to dispense with the reading and without objection, so ordered. Now recognize the gentleman to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Johnson. This amendment would establish a National Advisory Committee on Wildland Fire Risk Reduction. which would ensure that key non-federal stakeholders and the practitioners originally overlooked by this bill will have a chance to engage in wildland fire risk reduction activities and help set the priorities for the strategic plan authorized in this act. This advisory committee would also offer assessments and recommendations on the management, coordination, implementation, and overall effectiveness of the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program. Members of the advisory committee will represent a wide range of technical disciplines, capacities, and communities involved in wildland fire impact reduction. It will combine scientific, architectural, and engineering expertise from within emergency management services, business communities, state, local, and tribal governments. It also should be noted that other federal hazard programs established by Congress, such as the National Windstorms Impact Reduction Program and the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, both of which served as the model for this program, both have advisory committees. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, which gives stakeholders and practitioners a seat at the table in deciding how the federal government should be addressing wildland fire risk reduction. And with that, Madam Chair, I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much. I'll yield myself some time. This amendment established an advisory committee with members from academia, industry, emergency management agencies, state and local and tribal governments to offer assessments and make recommendations to improve the program. It is important that we have a wide range of expert stakeholders for the input into the program, and the advisory committee would ensure that. I support this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Any further requests for time?
Madam Chair, just Perlmutter.
Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Just a quick comment. I'm sure that if Mr. Lucas's amendment is adopted, that he will support this bill. I yield back.
Any further requests for time? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. Our next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by Mr. Berra, and he's recognized to explain his amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 6, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Berra of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize Mr. Berra for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas. I rise to offer an amendment to improve research and development of firefighter decontamination technologies and the development of peer support resources for wildland firefighters. My home state of California continues to face dangerous wildfires year after year. The 7 largest wildfires in California history have occurred within the last 4 years, with 5 of those happening in 2020 alone. The significant increase in deadly wildfires puts wildland firefighters at continued risk and extended periods of stress. My amendment would continue critical research into decontamination methods of firefighting gear and study the impact of PFAS and other potentially harmful contaminants in firefighting gear, fire retardants, and other equipment. While the dangers of these chemicals are known in other contexts, more information is needed on the damage of long-term exposure to these contaminants for firefighters and how we can improve decontamination of firefighting equipment. In addition, my amendment would also require the development of resources to establish or enhance peer support programs for wildland firefighting resources. While our first responders already experience higher mental health stress and higher risk of suicide than many other professions, the last year and a half spent responding to the COVID-19 pandemic is only increasing those burdens. In particular, the pandemic has stretched wildfire firefighting units thin. This peer support language is similar to a provision in my legislation, the HERO Act, which passed the House earlier this year to provide peer support resources for first responders and healthcare professionals. I want to thank the committee staff and Congresswoman Lofgren's office for working with me to develop my amendments to strengthen this important bill. I encourage all my colleagues to support this important amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Anyone else seeking time?
Madam Chairwoman,
Ms. Lofgren is represented.
I move to strike the last word briefly just to thank Mr. Barrow for this amendment. We all agree that supporting the health and safety of firefighters is of the utmost importance, and I look forward to supporting this amendment. I urge everyone else to do so and yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is amendment offered by the gentle lady from California, Ms. Kim. She's recognized to offer her amendment.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 7, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mrs. Kim of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered, and I recognize the gentle lady for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to note that I'm disappointed that the majority has taken this route to address wildland fires. This should be a bipartisan issue addressed in a bipartisan fashion, but this legislation is a departure from the traditional bipartisan nature of this committee. Republicans on this committee have been ready and willing to work on bipartisan wildfires legislation, and we did so with Representative Garcia's Fire Act. While I'm disappointed with how the majority handled this legislation, I worked closely with the committee staff to ensure we find ways to improve this legislation. I recently hosted a wildfire roundtable discussion with stakeholders from CAL FIRE, the Orange County Fire Authority, the National Weather Service, and community leaders to hear what fronts we can improve on in our wildfire response. And one of the highlighted issues of this roundtable was the need to improve communications between federal, state, local wildland fire first responders. The National Interagency Fire Center is responsible for coordinating federal resources during and firefighting efforts and works closely with firefighters on the ground. This amendment adds language directing the National Institute for Standards and Technology to execute a research plan on public safety communication coordination standards among federal, state, local, and tribal wildland firefighters, fire management response officials, and the National Interagency Fire Center, and directs NIST to carry out live and virtual field testing and measurement of equipment, software, and other technologies to develop standards for information disseminations and ultimately provide recommendations to the member agencies of the National Interagency Fire Center. In my home state, as noted by many of my California colleagues, wildfires can burn through acres of land in a matter of minutes, making it critical for wildland firefighters to receive forecasts, advisories, and alerts in real time. Examining and testing communications technologies used in wildland fire response is a critical step forward in improving the time it takes for information to get from top to bottom and bottom to top. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the young lady for her amendment. This amendment directs NIST to develop and carry out a research plan on public safety communications coordination standards among federal, state, local, and tribal wildland firefighters and the response officials. This research would also look to improve existing communication systems. This amendment would help to improve the communication and coordination on the ground during a wildland fire. I support this amendment. Is there further discussion on this amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. He is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 8, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of California.
It's unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objections to order. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment sort of builds on what Ms. Kim was just talking about, as well as comments Mr. Garcia and Mr. Lucas have made. It would ensure the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration collaborates with other agencies like NASA on its work in fire weather forecasting and alerts. And as we've heard in a number of our hearings, the testimony was that wildfires can create their own weather systems, including lightning, which makes it harder for fire managers to know what to expect when they're in the field. Improved fire weather analysis and forecasting will help us protect our firefighters and deploy the right assets safely as they work to combat the fire and protect life and property. One of the big wildfires we had last year created its own weather and exploded, literally exploded in a way that nobody predicted. And these are the kinds of things that we need to use all tools available to us to better understand how our fires are changing so we can be better prepared to fight them. This amendment will improve collaboration between the agencies to accomplish just that. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Any further discussion? This amendment ensures that NOAA coordinates with other federal agencies when developing and providing fire alerts and warnings. I support this amendment. If there's no further discussion, a vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Kim. She's recognized.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 9, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Ms. Kim of California.
Without objection, the dispensing of the reading. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For years, this committee has heard directly from the National Weather Service, weather stakeholders, and wildland fire response officials about the need to hire more incident meteorologists. In October, Dr. Usalini and Mr. Warner testified before this committee regarding the need for incident meteorologists, and the Government Accountability Office has conducted reviews and published reports on this need. And my amendment directs the National Weather Service to provide a roadmap for overcoming the challenges identified in that incident meteorologist workforce assessment. As a part of this roadmap, the National Weather Service will project the expected number of IMETs needed over the next 5 years and identify the hiring authorities necessary to overcome identified training and workforce challenges and identify alternative services needed to meet operational needs. Wildfires continue to worsen in my home state every year, and IMETs play a critical role in getting accurate forecasts to federal fire response management officials and to wildland firefighters on the ground. As weather events get more extreme, a robust IMET workforce at the National Weather Service is critical. This amendment ensures we get the action plan we need to restore the National Weather Service's IMET workforce and get accurate forecasts to firefighters on the ground and to our affected constituents. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
A gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes in support of this amendment. The underlying bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute direct NOAA to conduct an assessment of the incident meteorological workforce at the National Weather Service. This amendment provides further direction for this assessment that will make it more actionable, and I thank Representative Kim for offering this amendment, as the workforce challenges facing IMETs are, of course, very real. I have a particular interest in this issue. My bill, the Firefighter Fair Pay Act, which was mentioned by one of the witnesses during this committee's October 14th hearing on the future of forecasting, would seek to address the unfair pay cap that IMETs and federal wildlife firefighters face. And I think this amendment will help in that regard as well. So I yield back my time to myself, or do further members seek recognition on the gentlelady's amendment? Seeing none, I ask the clerk will, let's see, I think we will, all those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
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 Opposed will say no. There are no no's. The amendment passes. We now have an amendment offered by Mr. Obernolte. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 10, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Obernolte of California. Page 14, line 17. Strike the second. And
Madam Chair, I move to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
The amendment is the reading without objection. The reading of the amendment is waived, and Mr. Obernolte is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've said previously, one of the things that I find the most exciting about this bill is the way that it expands the universe of what we know about the science behind fighting and mitigating wildfires. However, I think it's also important that we know what we don't know. In other words, that we use this opportunity to highlight the areas that are going to need further research in the future. And that's one of the things that my amendment does is it expands the scope of research to also identify potential gaps in the data that we're collecting and identify different areas of fruitful research that's needed to advance to wildfire science in the future. Also, I think that in this bill, one of the things that's very interesting about it is the way that it makes NOAA kind of the tip of the spear in conducting this kind of research. And I think that that agency is very well equipped to take on that role. But obviously, they're collecting data not just for themselves, but for a wide variety of different stakeholders and other agencies that are then going to rely on that data to make real changes in the way that we respond to and mitigate these wildfires. So I would hope that they would engage those agencies proactively. That would be my expectation. But just to make it explicit, I think we ought to state that that's the goal here in the legislation. And that's one of the things that this amendment does, is to make it explicit that other relevant federal programs are consulted by the NOAA as they undertake this research. It's my expectation that they would coordinate with partners such as the National Interagency Fire Center and the Joint Fire Science Program to ensure that we're getting the right data that we need to further our management of these wildfires. So with that, I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in support of this amendment. The amendment further ensures that the work conducted through the program established in this bill will advance fire science, and it's a good addition to the bill. Do other members wish to be recognized or heard on this amendment? Seeing no one, all in favor will say aye.
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 All
Aye.
say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 11, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Garcia of California.
The further reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I rise in support of my amendment that would strike a portion of Section 6 of the underlying bill, specifically paragraph 4, titled Wildland Fire, Fire Weather Surveillance and Observation, as well as paragraph 5, which addresses fire weather test beds, and replace this language with effectively my Fire Act, which is in fact a bipartisan bill with 4 California Dem co-sponsors. It's also a bicameral bill that would provide a more targeted authorization for the new wildfire activities within NOAA. The Fire Act directs NOAA to establish a new program in collaboration with industry and academia to improve wildfire forecasting and detection. The bill provides NOAA with a clear set of goals and a narrow set of technological areas of focus identified as areas of interest by the agency. So this amendment has the support of NOAA, not only in terms of the cost footprint, but also the scope and the 5 key areas, such as advanced satellite detection products, grid-based assessments and outlooks of fuel, moisture, and danger levels, coupled atmosphere and fire modeling systems linked to climate predictions to achievable land management decisions, improved spatial and temporal resolution observations at higher latitudes. These are things that are literally closing the gaps in NOAA skill sets in terms of modeling, forecasting, and testing. In order to conduct the development tests and development activities identified, the bill authorizes the construction of 1 or more fire weather research test beds in partnership with industry and academia to develop improved detection and forecast capabilities for wildfire events and their impacts. And whereas the underlying bill authorizes more than $200 million a year for similar purposes, mine authorizes a much more reasonable amount of $15 million, which is, again, what NOAA said they needed in order to conduct this scope. And I truly believe that, despite the rhetoric here today, that both colleagues on both sides of the aisle truly want to see a reduction in the devastation and destruction of the wildfires that we're seeing, especially out west. And we've talked about what has happened here. I will say, though, that I think it is disingenuous to say that I didn't reach out. And yes, I'm new to Congress, so maybe I'm a little more optimistic and less jaded, having only been here for 1.5 years. But I do believe we followed the protocols, and my colleague from California made it very clear that she did not want to work with me on this. And I think both majority and minority staffs will attest to that. To say that the Fire Act does nothing is also, I think, misleading. Many of the amendments that we're adopting here, including Mr. Perlmutter's, were within the scope of the Fire Act and do exactly as we said. I don't think that she's read the bill, so I don't think that that's a fair statement to say that the Fire Act does nothing. In fact, the scope and clarity of that is actually very commensurate with what we're actually voting on, but at different dollar values today. The fight against wildfire should be a bipartisan effort, and my bill is evidence that it can be. And while the underlying bill falls short, I hope that we can come together on this important issue and pass bipartisan legislation out of the committee to confront the growing disasters. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. It has the clarity and cost point that's commensurate with the scope that we're asking NOAA to conduct. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would strike and replace the NOAA Wildland Fire and Fire Weather Surveillance and Observation subsection from the amendment in the nature of a substitute with the text of Mr. Garcia's Fire Act. The language in the ANS that we have offered provides direction for NOAA to leverage existing observations and assets for wildland fire and smoke detection. The language in the ANS would also require NOAA to prioritize wildland fire and smoke detection and observation as part of its observing systems requirements and for commercial data purchases. Additionally, the ANS directs NOAA to establish a fire weather testbed in collaboration with other program agencies and stakeholders. This ensures that fire weather products and services developed through this testbed would meet stakeholder needs. Mr. Garcia's amendment does not provide comparable direction to NOAA for either observation systems or a fire weather testbed. I appreciate Mr. Garcia's interest in addressing the growing threat of wildland fires, but I must oppose the amendment because it does reduce important elements of the bill. I would like to just briefly mention, because there's been a little bit of discussion and frankly criticism of me as the author about bipartisanship. Let me just say that I know how to do bipartisanship. One of the most bipartisan bills passed by the House, one of the highest percentages of both Republican and Democratic votes under a rule, was my bipartisan Farm Worker Modernization Act that we worked on for over a year. I believe in bipartisanship that's more than just on paper. And I do also want to mention that I did seek out Republican co-sponsors who I thought could help push this bill through across the finish line, and Republicans that cared about the substance. Now, Mr. Ranking Member Lucas mentioned the minority had the ANS for 11 days, but we provided the first working draft on October 21st, plenty of time to provide a feedback, which we solicited. I haven't worked with Representative Garcia. His only bill is that I mentioned before, looks to me like a messaging bill. He may feel differently, but I would like to point out that Representative Garcia never spoke to me and his staff never spoke to mine. Now, I hope that in the future we can remedy that. We're both from the same state. We both want to fight fires successfully, and let's get this bill done, and hopefully we'll have a discussion. But at this point, this amendment is a step backwards on the bill itself, and I urge that it be opposed. Are there further members who wish to be recognized?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Well, you've already been recognized, but let's have somebody else be recognized and yield to you. Who would like to do that? Mr. Lucas probably wants to do that.
Absolutely, Madam Chair.
The gentleman, yes, the gentleman is recognized, and I assume is yielding to Mr. Garcia.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I certainly meant nothing personal by what we have been making the comments about relative to partisanship. I know you have worked in the past in a spirit of bipartisanship. I would just submit that, bipartisanship is more than just informing us and asking for feedback with 11 days of runway. It's actually collaborating and trying to close all the gaps that our legislation have. Nothing is perfect out of the gates. And I concede that perhaps the Fire Act deserves more courtship. I'm willing to commit to that and look forward to further discussions on this. Certainly not a personal issue. This is a matter of just making sure that we're doing what's right for the American people, especially Californians. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Lucas.
With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
A gentleman yields back. So the question then is on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, I request a recorded vote.
A requested vote has been requested. A roll call vote and further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. The next amendment is by Mr. Babin, number 12. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 12, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with, and I recognize Mr. Babin to address his amendment. Mr. Babin, you're recognized. You're muted, I think, Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin?
He's in the hearing room. He's trying to do something.
He's now unmuted. Nope. Mr. Babin?
Unmute. There you go. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
You are now recognized.
Thank you. I had kind of a stubborn iPad here. I'm sorry. My amendment is simple. I would strengthen the use of commercial remote sensing data buys throughout this bill. As currently drafted, there's hardly any reference to the significant role that our commercial remote sensing industry can play in forecasting, monitoring, and mitigating these wildfires that are plaguing the West Coast and the Midwest. One of the most important tools in preventing and responding to forest fires is data collected by commercial satellites. Some civil agencies like NASA and NOAA already procure commercial remote sensing data for earth science and weather monitoring. But this amendment would specifically authorize the purchase of commercial remote sensing data to meet our nation's wildfire challenge. Companies like Planet from San Francisco, California, Maxar from Westminster, Colorado, Spire from San Francisco, California, and Boulder, Colorado, Black Sky from Seattle, Washington, and Herndon, Virginia, Worldview from Tucson, Arizona, and Capella Space from San Francisco, California, amongst many others, can provide vital imagery to forecasters, land managers, and to first responders. While civil agencies can access federal remote sensing data from existing national systems and contracts, more can be done to enable the industry to meet the national challenge that these wildfires are presenting. The underlying bill and the amendment in the nature of a substitute would benefit greatly from my amendment, which would provide focus, specific direction, and prioritization for acquiring commercial remote sensing data. In addition to the traditional imagery provided under current contracts, my amendment would allow agencies to procure new and novel data like synthetic aperture radar and thermal and infrared imaging, which would significantly help address wildfires. My amendment also recognizes the revolution taking place in commercial remote sensing and prioritizes the government's procurement of data over the development of redundant and often duplicative systems. This would save taxpayers money and allow for more funding to go to mitigation. It would also support a high-tech field that provides high-paying and high-skilled jobs. U.S. law and national policy directs NASA to advance the commercial space sector. Title 51 of the U.S. Code directs NASA to seek and encourage to the maximum extent possible the fullest commercial use of space. NASA is also directed to acquire, where cost-effective, space-based and airborne Earth remote sensing data, surfaces, distribution, and applications from a commercial provider. And Title 51 also expressed a preference for private sector land remote sensing systems. The 2014 National Plan for Civil Earth Observations directed federal agencies to identify and pursue commercial solutions. More recently, the 2019 National Plan for Civil Earth Observations directed agencies to strive to engage with the full Earth observations enterprise to determine whether there is a commercial solution available or in process that might be more appropriate than creation of a federal observing asset. The plan also prioritized expanding the purchase of Earth observations data and services from the private sector and or through public-private partnerships. My amendment would simply implement these existing laws and policies. And I would urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself First, to thank the ranking member of the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee for his interest in the topic of data provision, especially commercial data for research and development on reducing the risk of wildland fires. Respectfully, however, I must oppose the gentleman's amendment as drafted. The amendment proposes to mandate that NOAA and NASA purchase commercial remote sensing data on wildland fires. Now, while commercial remote sensing data could contribute to the activities in this bill where appropriate, the amendment mandates the purchase of such data without sufficient checks and balances or justification or determination that such data is cost effective and necessary. It would mandate that NOAA enter into contracts for commercial data purchases, and it would mandate that NASA prioritize commercial data purchases over use of NASA-collected space-based Earth observation data. Should it or NOAA be responsible for unlimited commercial data purchases on wildfires for the entire interagency program established in this bill? I think not. The base text of this ANS includes consideration of options for NASA to supplement or enhance remote sensing data, such as with commercial solutions, as appropriate and practicable. The ANS also gives NOAA the authority to acquire new data to enhance observations of wildland fire and associated smoke. It also includes language on partnerships with government, industry, academia, and the like where appropriate. Now, we did work in good faith with the author of the amendment to propose an alternative that would strengthen language on commercial data by directing NASA to use existing federal government purchased commercial remote sensing data for wildfire efforts and to purchase commercial data where deemed necessary based on consultation with program agencies, where we worked together, and I believe in good faith, but they proposed a balance that we suggested, I believe, would more than meet the spirit of the gentleman's interest in the contributions of remote sensing data. We weren't able to get an agreement between Congressman Babin and myself, but I hope that we can continue to work to address this issue between now and the floor, and that we'll have an opportunity to reach consensus on this issue. But for now, I have to oppose the amendment as drafted, with the hopes that we will continue to talk and get agreement on this important matter between now and the floor. And I yield back. Do additional members wish to be heard on the amendment?
Madam Chair, Frank Lucas.
Mr. Lucas, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And with that, I yield to Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I appreciate that. Appreciate my colleagues' efforts to work with me, Madam Chair, to strengthen the bill. But as it stands, the underlying bill does very little to address the challenge posed by these wildfires. It simply reinforces the status quo. But this inaction comes with a cost. There's a missed opportunity to greatly assist civil agencies, as well as state, local, and tribal entities. It could provide scientists, emergency coordinators, and first responders with timely, actionable, and existing data on wildfires that is rapidly shareable and reflects the state of the art, not the state of the past. While my colleagues offered a compromise to this language, it was heavily watered down to the point of undermining the very intent to enable the expanded use of commercial remote sensing capabilities to address wildfires. Commercial solutions, public-private partnerships, and data buys have been recommended in numerous policies and laws for many years. The 2007 and the 2018 Earth Science Decadal Reviews call for expansion of these efforts, and so does the 2014 and 2019 National Plans for Civil Earth Observations. U.S. law also directs the prioritization of commercial remote sensing data acquisition. My amendment has the support of commercial remote sensing companies. It would benefit the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. government, state, local, and tribal entities, U.S. industry, and our overall wildfire enterprise. I would urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
And does the ranking member also yield back?
Yes, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. And I want to thank the good doctor for offering this amendment on an issue we have worked long and hard on over the years, and really have brought the commercial field into our various agencies. But he's done it in a way that it doesn't work. And we've actually worked out language in prior pieces of legislation that aren't mandatory, aren't so prescriptive. Remember, the federal government at this point is the customer, and the customer should have an opportunity either, for instance, Fire Guard would be the Department of Defense may have something that is more important, more valuable than something that might be in the commercial sector. So I think the gentleman is definitely onto something. I support the basic substance of his amendment. And I'll say wildfires require an all-of-government response, which is exactly the purpose of the legislation. The bill includes important opportunities for program agencies to work with the commercial sector to acquire data and services to improve our understanding of wildfires. And I appreciate the gentleman's interest in expanding the use of commercial data products from satellites or other airborne data sources to support these efforts. In fact, he's mentioned a couple of the companies that are in my district who really do very, very good work. Unfortunately, the gentleman's amendment is overly prescriptive and requiring agencies to use commercial data by using shall language, which leaves the agencies without discretion to use commercial data sources as appropriate. So they have this as an important tool as they carry out work. So I must oppose this amendment as written. I was going to offer what I thought would be a second degree amendment and take out his shalls and put in mays, but for the procedural geeks out there, this would be a third degree amendment, and I can't do that. So what I'm going to offer is I'm going to oppose this particular amendment, Dr. Babin, but I'm going to offer your amendment, but make it permissive language, which is what you and I have offered in the past on NOAA bills, on the commercial space bill, so that the agencies have the right to seek out commercial sources, but they don't have to if the information is better coming from some other agency like the Department of Defense or even the intelligence agencies. So I want to tell my friend and all my colleagues that I plan to offer another amendment at the end of the markup, which I will be submitting shortly with what I believe to be strong compromise language discussed between majority and minority staff yesterday on this issue. And with that, I urge my colleagues to oppose my friend's amendment, even though I agree with most of it, and ultimately adopt a similar amendment I will offer at the end of the markup. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, then the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor will say aye.
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 All opposed will say no.
No.
So the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is
Request a recorded vote, Madam Chair.
Gentlemen, request a recorded vote, and further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. LaTurner. He is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 13, amendment to the amendment.
Unanimous consent that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with, and without objection, that is so ordered. And Mr. LaTurner, you are recognized in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman. The purpose of my amendment is simple: ensuring that prescribed fires and the science behind them are given the same focus as wildland fires. In a recent peer review article in the journal Fire Ecology, the authors found that the federal fire management agencies fund wildfire-focused projects 3-to-1 over prescribed fire projects, even though there are far more prescribed fires in the United States than wildfires every year. Prescribed burning has played an integral part in the development of native grasslands throughout the central United States. Kansas has nearly 19 million grassland acres and is home to the Flint Hills, the largest section of intact tall grass prairie in the country that stretches from the north side of the state into Oklahoma. Prescribed burning is an essential tool for maintenance and improvement of the land, helping to control invasive woody species, maintaining a quality wildlife habitat, and effectively managing fuels. Trained and certified land managers carry out burns on both public and private lands throughout the state, ensuring the process is safe. Due to prescribed fires differing in behavior, effects, and even smoke from wildfires, it is important to recognize the distinction and ensure opportunities to fund research projects exist. Additionally, this amendment would authorize NOAA to establish one or more national centers for prescribed fires. This would allow a diverse group of fire researchers to come together and leverage federal research and development efforts with non-governmental organizations and universities such as Kansas State that conduct environmental and air quality research, ensuring that prescribed fires have the same collaboration and coordination that we see in the fire weather test bed authorized by the underlying bill. In pursuing the effort of reducing wildland fire risks, I believe it is important to recognize the vital role prescribed burning plays across the Great Plains and the environmental benefits it provides. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself to thank the gentleman for offering this amendment, which will advance our understanding of prescribed fires, which are an important tool in our toolbox to address wildland fires. I support his amendment and hope that the rest of the committee will as well. Do other individuals wish to be heard on this amendment? If not, then the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The next amendment is on the roster, is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber. He is now recognized to offer his amendment.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 14, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
I ask
substitute.
unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. That is so ordered, and the gentleman is recognized in support of this bill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment improves and strengthens the Department of Energy provisions in this bill by adding language to more comprehensively leverage the resources of the department's national laboratories, and by directing DOE to carry out R&D activities that will actually improve coordination between utilities and federal agencies. The constantly evolving risks posed by physical threats to the electric grid cannot be overstated. In the past few years, we've all seen the damage caused by severe natural events, including wildfires. The Department of Energy has a major role to play in our federal efforts to improve wildland fire mitigation. The energy sector faces unique challenges that require institutional knowledge and data that only the Department of Energy can provide. DOE is responsible for energy critical infrastructure and supports R&D in advanced grid modeling and advanced control systems. By partnering with industry, DOE can provide key stakeholders like public utilities with critical expertise and enable the deployment of new approaches to addressing emerging energy sector challenges. This is why my amendment asks a requirement for the Department of Energy to develop tools, adds a requirement to develop tools, techniques, and technologies that can improve coordination between utilities and the relevant federal agencies to enable communication, information sharing, and situational awareness in the event of wildland fires that impact the electric grid. But we must remember, when it comes to addressing these physical and environmental threats, that DOE's expertise is not just limited to grid R&D. I'll remind us all again, DOE is the largest federal sponsor of basic research in the physical sciences. Through its world-leading national laboratory system, the department supports cutting-edge user facilities, high-performance computing capabilities, and environmental system modeling resources. These critical assets can and should be fully deployed to address major issues like wildland fires. By doing so, we can accelerate fundamental research to not only help us to improve our awareness of energy sector risk, but also to improve the accuracy of our efforts to better understand as well as predict wildland fire behavior and occurrence and to mitigate those impacts. My amendment adds additional provisions to emphasize the importance of this work. It directs DOE to carry out R&D activities to utilize those national laboratory capabilities. It also requires that no administrator consult with the Secretary of Energy to acquire high-performance computing as well as supercomputing capabilities for wildland fire R&D activities and to leverage existing resources as practical. I believe these are common sense provisions that will substantially improve this legislation. Unfortunately, as the ranking member pointed out in his remarks, we did not have an opportunity to come to the table and provide input on this bill prior to its introduction. For this reason, there's much work to be done on this bill that actually can be done in the markup today. I know we can't agree on everything, especially when partisan procedures and messaging exercises seem to rule the day. However, when we identify our shared priorities and work together in good faith, we can put together productive legislation and find a path forward for the benefit of the American people. This is the purpose as well as the spirit of my amendment, which is just one small step in the right direction. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. This amendment contributes to DOE's mission in wildland fire R&D by directing the department of leverage national lab-based capabilities to improve wildland fire prediction. The national labs have important capabilities, including user facilities, earth and environmental systems, modeling results, resources, and high-performance computing and data analytics. That can be significantly accelerate the progress in this area of research. The amendment also seeks a foster improved coordination between utilities and relevant federal agencies on the impact of wildland fires to the grid. This is also critically important since better communication, information sharing, and situational awareness will help minimize impacts to power delivery and reduce the impacts of emergency shutoffs. I support this amendment and yield back. Any further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair, Perlmutter, like to strike the last word.
Mr. Perlmutter is recognized.
Thanks. I know I've been talking a lot on this bill, but this is a very important bill to Colorado. And I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for this amendment. And this amendment ensures we utilize the resources and technology at the Department of Energy as we work to improve our understanding of wildfire science. DOE's Earth Systems modeling capabilities, which Mr. Weber discussed, and high-performance computing will help us better forecast and create models for how the wildfires and smoke behave. For example, NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab's computational modeling can provide real-time data on how different weather patterns interact with each other and impact our energy infrastructure. We can use this technology to better improve our modeling and understanding of wildfire behavior. I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this amendment. I urge that all of us support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further requests for time? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. The amendment is adopted. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra. He's recognized for office amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment number 15, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Barra of California.
Action that is consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas. I rise to offer an amendment that would expand research into the impacts of wildland fire and smoke on drinking water supply and freshwater ecosystems. My amendment is simple. It would require the EPA to continue research into the impact of wildland fire and smoke on the drinking water supply and freshwater ecosystems. In particular, more research is needed on the impacts of wildfire smoke on water quality. California relies on rainfall and snowpack that flows through our rivers and the groundwater supplies that gets replenished during wet years. During periods of drought like our state is experiencing right now, groundwater is important to the survival of our farms and families. Both of these can be severely impacted after a wildfire. I also have heard from local stakeholders about the damage from wildfire debris and smoke on our watershed. Clean water is critical to the hundreds of animal species that live in our rivers, lakes, and streams, and we must do additional research on the impact of these wildfires on the survival of these species. Water quality and the availability of clean water is key to our economy. It is essential that we understand the damage wildfires can cause to drinking water and ecosystems to avoid short-term disruptions after a wildfire and examine the potential for longer-term damage to our water supply. I hope that you can all support my amendment to address this important issue. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion?
Madam Chairwoman, I just wanted to thank Mr. Barra for offering this amendment. It helps ensure that EPA will study the impact of wildland fire and smoke on drinking water and freshwater ecosystems, which is so important. And I hope that the whole committee will support his amendment. I yield.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia. And Mr. Garcia, you're recognized to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 16, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Garcia of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense of the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my amendment that simply clarifies some of the language in the bill to ensure that the legislation is working to actually reduce the need of emergency power shutoff protocols that some parts of our country are experiencing as a result of past fires and policies that our states have implemented in the wake of those fires. For a number of years now in California, we've had what are known as PSPS, or public safety power shutoffs, frequently year-round. And this is actually something that's getting used more and more frequently and frankly is starting to be abused by local utility companies. They're essentially power shutoffs designed to reduce the chance of power lines sparking an event during what is supposed to be during extreme weather conditions, but are being applied now to weather conditions where we're not actually seeing extreme weather. And I'll talk to that here in a second. PSPS should have been a Band-Aid while the state of California fortified risky power lines to permanently address the threat that sparking posed. Unfortunately, it's become effectively a crutch for utility companies, and now is an all too routine part of life in California with no end in sight. To give you a sense of how often this is implemented, in the last, during the month of October, we had 11 warnings or actual events of power shutoffs just in my zip code. Throughout my district, we had dozens of either threats of power shutoffs or actual power shutoffs during what were being called high wind events. In many cases, the winds as slow as 10 knots in our district. At the federal level, it's critical that we work to end this type of behavior similar to the PSPS activity, particularly if the states are not going to end it and or abuse it. And my amendment does not ban preventative or preemptive shutoffs. It simply says that assistance provided by the Department of Energy should empower states to make power shutoff protocols a measure of last resort instead of a measure of first resort, or as a first tool in their toolboxes. In my district, we saw a PSPS event where a community lost their power preemptively. And again, this wasn't for emergency purposes. This was to preempt a risk of fire for 4 days. Acton and Agua Dulce lost power in those areas anywhere from a consecutive and continuous 3 to 4 days. And in those areas, they don't only lose their water, but they also lose, their power. They also lose their water because their water is driven by electric wells. So you had constituents who were effectively without water, without power for 3 to 4 days on end. And this is actually imparting a more emergency situation and more dire straits for our constituents than the risk of fire was in the first place. Disrupts emergency services, businesses, and families. They've caused Californians to spend millions of dollars on generators since the inception, and they're increasingly utilized anytime effectively the wind is blowing. And again, we're seeing this during non-emergency situations with winds as low as, say, 10 knots. We even saw power shutoffs being implemented when it was actually drizzling outside, which is a rare occasion in California, but obviously not needed to shut off our power for. A better balance must be struck that effectively reduces the risk of wildfires from sparking, while also ensuring that residents have continual access to the power that they pay for. I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any requests for time?
Madam Chairwoman?
Chair recognizes Ms. Lawson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chairwoman. This amendment would remove language in the underlying matter that seeks to develop tools and technologies that are necessary to execute emergency power shutoffs in the event of wildland fires. It would replace those provisions with the language that Mr. Garcia has mentioned, that the actions could only be taken as a last resort. Now, I share his interest in having the Department of Energy's ultimate goal to reduce the need for and length of power disruptions amid natural disasters like wildland fires. That's why we think it's important to invest in technologies and tools and methods for mitigating hazards to the grid, minimizing the impact of necessary power shutoffs, and enabling the safe and timely restoration of power. But removing the underlying measures that will allow us to manage that smarter with more technology that limits the impact, I think is a mistake. My staff, and working with Mr. Garcia's staff, said we would very much support his amendment as an addition to the underlying bill, because we agree it should be the last resort. But to substitute the technology, tools, and development that are in the underlying bill is not something I can support. I think it's not realistic at this point, and it would be, I think, not responsible for us to deny the Department of Energy the authority and tools necessary for carrying them out if circumstances require. Like Mr. Garcia's constituents, these reductions in power are infuriating, and I frankly think in our state of California, the Public Utilities Commission could be a lot more energized than they have been, since they are the regulatory authority for the PG&E, which is probably the worst offender in the state, although not the only offender. That's not really within our jurisdiction. But as I mentioned, I would certainly support this as an addition, but I can't support this as a substitution for the underlying technology tools. And so I must oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any other requests for time? Were you seeking time, Mr. Garcia?
No, Madam Chair.
If there's no further request for time, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra. He's recognized.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 17, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Feenstra of Iowa.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas. My amendment would create an opportunity to utilize biomass collected from wildfire and mitigation and post-fire recovery activities to create bioenergy, including biofuels. Since coming to Congress, I have had a focus on alternative fuels and alternative forms of energy. The recent shocking surge of fuel prices highlights the importance of research and development on cost-effective biofuels. From my amendment in this committee focused on biofuels to my own bills on biofuel hydrogen cell batteries and alternate aviation fuels, I've made this my priority. Clearing excess undergrowth and down forest materials from our wildlands is an important step in wildfire mitigation and prevention. Though harmless in normal conditions, these organic materials can create a tinderbox to spread or sustain a wildfire. However, this process of clearing can be expensive for our communities. This amendment expands the Department of DOE research and development activities that this bill authorizes to include activities focused on using biomass resulting from fire mitigation and recovery activities to create bioenergy. Feedstocks such as corn and soybeans currently fuel Iowa's thriving bioenergy industry. However, cellulosic wood-based biomass such as agricultural waste and forest undergrowth is much more difficult to utilize due to its difficulties in breaking it down efficiently. Development of easier, cost-effective processes for converting these materials of biofuels could benefit fire-prone communities as well as farmers in the Midwest. The idea of turning biomass into energy is not new. In fact, just last week, I was in Oregon where Representative Cliff Bentz in his district, where we saw forest underbrush biomass conversion firsthand. And earlier this year, the Lawrence Berkeley and Sandia National Laboratories celebrated their research development on new processes to convert woody plant matter into biofuels. This amendment improves this bill by harnessing the DOE's expertise to address important challenges, researching new ways to create bioenergy from excess vegetation, and has potential not only provide a new fuel source, but to create an additional economic value for smart wildlife mitigation. Productive, cost-effective uses of forest materials remove cost offsets that could be critical to management activities. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the remaining part of my time.
Thank you. Any further requests for time?
Madam Chairwoman.
Ms. Lofgren is recognized.
Thank you. You know, it makes sense to me to find a productive use for biomass removed from our lands in attempts to reduce the risk of wildland fires. And the Department of Energy's Bioenergy Technologies Office, I think it's the right place to perform research on utilizing this material for bioenergy uses. I support this type of research. However, we were not able to receive technical assistance on this amendment from the Department of Energy prior to this markup. We're going to continue to work to receive that feedback, and I'm assuming that we will be working with Mr. Feenstra to incorporate it if they have technical advice for us between now and the floor. And with that understanding, I would urge support of this amendment and look forward to working with Congressman Feenstra.
If any further discussion?
Madam Chair, Congressman Baird, I'd like to speak.
Yes, you're recognized.
I just want to support Representative Feenstra's amendment. I think utilizing cellulosic material, including that like forest products that have lignin in them, deserves an increased support for research, because there's a tremendous potential for agriculture and the forest industry to contribute to our energy needs. And so I just want to support this amendment.
Thank you. Any further discussion? If no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The amendment is agreed to, subject to the condition of Ms. Lawford. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 18, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered, and I now recognize the gentleman to explain his amendment.
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is kind of a belt and suspenders amendment. It builds on Mr. Weber's amendment earlier that I co-sponsored, as well as a couple of the others, just making sure that we have as many agencies focused on this problem as possible. So my amendment will expand the Department of Energy's activities under the Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program to include fire modeling, forecasting fire spread, and analysis of wildfire fuels. The Department of Energy plays an important role in our efforts to mitigate the impacts of wildfire, which often threaten to disrupt power systems and damage electric grid infrastructure. The National Renewable Energy Lab has been working on modeling, simulation, and other computational tools to improve our ability to predict wildfires, forecast how a fire is going to spread, and evaluate how grasses, shrubs, trees, and dead leaves might contribute to wildfire growth and speed. More accurate detection of and data on when a fire starts will help increase warning times to allow communities to evacuate, protect their homes, and will give our firefighters better tools to understand how to fight these growing fires. And as I said at the beginning, we actually have 2 communities that just had to evacuate as a result of a wildfire that was sparked earlier today near Rocky Mountain National Park. So the bill we're working on, the amendments we're bringing up are absolutely needed and timely. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any requests for time?
There are procedural votes on the remaining Babin Garcia amendments that have to be taken.
Madam Chairwoman, I just want to commend Mr. Perlmutter for this really sensible amendment. And it is critically important to the mission of the department, since it carries severe consequences for energy infrastructure or wildfire threats. So thank you, and I look forward to voting for it.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? The vote then occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is approved. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin, you're recognized to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
Okay.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 19, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
I ask
H.R.
unanimous consent to dispense with the reading and without objection so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My amendment would initiate an independent review of the Civil Applications Committee by the National Academies of Public Administration. The Science, Space, and Technology Committee has a long history of providing guidance to the Department of Interior and interagency processes related to the geospatial data, particularly the Land Remote Sensing Program. My amendment would continue this support. The CAC, acting through the U.S. Geological Survey National Civil Applications Program, serves federal civil agencies by providing for the acquisition, dissemination, and exploitation of classified remote sensing systems and data in support of mission responsibilities for land and resource management, environmental and scientific studies, homeland security, and hazards and disaster management. Civil applications of classified remotely sensed images began in 1969 when the USGS provided federal civil agencies with access to imagery for various uses, including mapping, charting, geodesy, and management of the nation's lands and resources. The CAC was established in 1975 by executive direction to provide oversight and coordination of these activities. The CAC is composed of 11 federal departments and independent agencies. The USGS, through the Secretary of Interior, is delegated responsibility to chair the CAC. In addition to providing data from classified systems, the CAC also serves as a conduit for commercial remote sensing data from existing government contracts. The use of classified remotely sensed data as well as commercial remote sensing data has increased dramatically over the past 10 years. There's been an expanded emphasis on using data for environmental monitoring and research for hazards detection, warning, and emergency response. The USGS Advanced Systems Center, or ASC, in Reston, Virginia, is the hub of NCAP operations. The USGS operates regional facilities in Denver, Colorado, Rolla, Missouri, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Menlo Park, California. My amendment would provide a review of the CAC and the National Civil Applications Program in order to ensure that civil agencies are able to access necessary data in a timely fashion. Given this committee's role in establishing and fostering our nation's land remote sensing programs to manage land use, aid in environmental monitoring, conduct scientific investigations, and respond to hazards and disasters, this is an ideal opportunity to review critical organizations and programs like the CAC and the National Civil Applications Program are correctly aligned, resourced, and organized, particularly as it pertains to wildfires. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Is there any further discussion?
Madam Chairwoman.
The chair recognizes Ms. Lofgren.
I would insist on my point of order. The gentleman is correct. USGS is an important element of this whole thing. We were unable to include it in this bill because it's not within our committee's jurisdiction. And so this amendment is beyond this committee's jurisdiction. And the amendment is not germane, even though the intention is valid and one that I celebrate. And so I would insist on my point of order.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Babin, do you wish to be heard on this point of order?
Yes, I certainly do, Madam Chair.
You're recognized.
Thank you. This committee has a long history of legislating geospatial and remote sensing programs of federal agencies, including the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture. The purpose of the bill, as stated at the beginning of the bill, is to, quote, to improve the federal effort to reduce wildland fire risks and for other purposes. My amendments do just that. Representative Lofgren's underlying bill creates yet another interagency committee called the Committee on Wildfire Risk Reduction and directs that it be composed of the administrator of FEMA, the U.S. Fire Administrator, the Chief of the Forest Service, the Secretary of Interior, the Director of the U.S. Geological Survey, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. If there are concerns with the germaneness of my amendment, there are equally concerns with the underlying legislation itself. Creating an interagency coordinating committee for wildfires without recognizing an existing interagency coordinating committee that has been operating for over 50 years in support of wildfires is an oversight. The Civil Applications Committee and the National Civil Applications Program is directly tied to our committee's jurisdiction of commercial remote sensing and space-based geospatial information. It is also connected to the Land Remote Sensing Policy Act of 1992 that this committee authored. Ignoring these facts is very concerning. Just like the underlying bill before us, my amendment pertains to an interagency coordinating committee for wildfires. Moreover, my amendment is perhaps more germane in that the underlying committee is already established. This highlights the questions of whether the underlying bill is duplicative or potentially conflicting with existing successful programs and what that will do to our nation's wildfire prediction and response. The Land Remote Sensing Policy Act of 1992 was drafted by the Science Committee and referred solely to this committee. Regulations of commercial remote sensing, which significantly impact our ability to predict and respond to wildfires, are covered by this legislation. And so is the overarching Landsat program, in addition to the important research and development activities associated with land remote sensing. Ignoring these activities leaves a gaping hole in the underlying legislation. So I would urge the chair to reconsider her ruling, defend the committee's jurisdiction, and provide support to the Civil Applications Committee and the National Civil Applications Program that provide critical support to our nation's wildfire prevention and response. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The amendment is on a subject different from the subject matter of the bill under consideration. It proposes a completely different proposition to the bill's overall subject matter. Moreover, the activities of the Civil Applications Committee and the USGS National Civil Applications Program are not within our committee's jurisdiction. For these reasons, this amendment violates Clause 7 of Rule 16. The chair rules that the amendment is non-germane to the underlying text and a violation of House Rule 16. The point of order is sustained. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, and he's recognized to offer his amendment.
I have an amendment at the desk, Madam Chair.
I reserve point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 20, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 5.
To dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Commercial services that utilize modern technology offer effective new ways to gather and share information about wildland fires. For instance, real-time location tracking of personnel and equipment have increased the efficiency and safety of wildfire management. Additionally, the ability to use and share data on the physical characteristics of wildfires, emissions, and ambient monitoring puts the right information in the right hands at the right time. The Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture Forest Service have collaborated to develop requirements for the integration of tracking technology in wildfire operations. Allocating resources in real time enables fire managers to adjust their strategy and tactics quickly as conditions on the ground change. This amendment authorizes the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture to purchase, where cost effective, both space-based and airborne commercial data that provides the location, movement, and physical characteristics of wildfires. Commercial services also include communications, information technology, and tracking technology in wildfire operations. These services should be acquired to the extent possible and while satisfying requirements of the administration from multiple commercial providers. The House Science, Space, and Technology Committee reported the Land Remote Sensing Policy Act of 1992 and was the only committee that received a referral on the bill. That law contained a section establishing roles for the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture. That section is codified today in 51 U.S.C. 60131B. My amendment would simply add specificity regarding wildfires to the existing authority. I believe that we all want to do everything we can to provide civil agencies with the tools necessary to meet this challenge. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you very much. Any further discussion?
Madam Chair.
Ms. Lofgren is recognized.
I want to thank Congressman Babin for his thoughts here, and I think they're not wrong in terms of what he's trying to accomplish, but I think this amendment is not germane. We don't have jurisdiction to direct the Secretary of Agriculture or Interior about their agency's acquisition of data. The Land Remote Sensing Policy Act is unrelated to the underlying bill. Like many members of the committee, I would support expanding the jurisdiction of our science committee. I think that's actually long overdue. But until that happens, I don't think this amendment is germane, regrettably, and I think cannot be considered. And I yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you very much.
Does the gentlewoman insist on her point of order?
Are you insisting upon your point of order?
I am insisting on my point of order, Madam Chairwoman.
Okay, Mr. Babin, would you like to be heard on that point of order?
Yes, ma'am. I would just, in order to save time, I would just say the exact same remarks that I had for the previous amendment, that I think this is germane. With that, I'll yield back.
Okay. Well, the chair rules that this amendment is non-germane under the underlying text in violation of House Rule 16, and the point of order is sustained. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin. He's recognized to offer his amendment.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 21, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
To dispense with the reading and without objection, so order. The chair will now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commercial services that utilize modern technology offer effective new ways to gather and to share information about wildland fires. For instance, real-time location tracking of personnel and equipment. Excuse me, I'm on the wrong one. I apologize. My amendment would codify the Civil Applications Committee, CAC, charter and statute and provide congressional support, authorization, and guidance to this important activity that directly contributes to addressing the wildfire challenge. The Science, Space, and Technology Committee has a long history of providing guidance to the Department of Interior and interagency processes related to geospatial data, particularly the Land Remote Sensing Program, and my amendment would continue this support. The CAC was never specifically authorized by statute, but my amendment addresses this oversight. Given this committee's role in establishing and fostering our nation's land remote sensing programs to manage land use, aid in environmental monitoring, conduct scientific investigations, and to respond to hazards and disasters, this is a real ideal opportunity to codify CAC and the National Civil Applications Program and statute and provide stability and guidance, particularly as it pertains to wildfires. So I would urge my colleagues to support my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Is there further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair,
Chair recognizes Ms. Lofgren.
I would insist on my point of order. These are important contributions that the intelligence and defense communities can offer on wildfires, but they are outside of our jurisdiction to authorize the activities to the Director of Intelligence, and while codifying the office in the U.S. Geological Survey may be important to do, it's unrelated to the purpose of this bill and also beyond our jurisdiction, regrettably. I'd love to have USGS in our jurisdiction, but we don't have it. So for those reasons, I must insist on my point of order.
Thank you. Mr. Babin, do you wish to make further comments?
I would only, Madam Chair, would only make the same comments that I did before, that this is germane and an important aspect of what we're trying to do in order for wildfires. So with that, I would yield back.
Well, thank you. The chair rules that this amendment is non-germane to the underlying text in the violation of House Rule 16. The point of order is sustained. Next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 22, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by Mr. Garcia of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my amendment to underscore what Mr. Babin was discussing, the need to include more than just the scientific community if we want to comprehensively address wildfires in this country, particularly those out west. My amendment, which is the same language as the PROTECT Act that I introduced earlier this year, and is also included in a bipartisan federal forest management package, would create a categorical exclusion to the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA, for forest treatments projects under 10,000 acres, and a categorical exclusion for treatment projects under 30,000 acres if they've been developed through a collaborative process proposed by a resource advisory committee or covered by a community wildfire protection plan. If we really want to reduce the number and intensity of wildfires in the West, we must encourage scientific and technological advancements that create or improve actionable land management decisions. We must also cut the red tape that is currently preventing land managers from actually implementing the forest management decisions that ultimately reduce the number of fires and reduce the fuel that feed fires once they are started. Without including federal land management agencies and reducing regulatory barriers to more active land management, we cannot begin to holistically address the devastating wildfires that have destroyed homes, businesses, and lives throughout the West. While I know that my amendment falls outside of the committee's jurisdiction, it's a perfect example of the good work we could do if we simply worked with the other relevant committees in a bipartisan fashion. For this reason, I'll be withdrawing my amendment. I hope that as we move forward, the committee can work with our friends at the Natural Resources Committee and create a bipartisan bill that will actually tackle these issues. Madam Chair, I withdraw my amendment.
Thank you very much. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. You recognize to offer your amendment.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 23, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5781, offered by
There's
Mr.
unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objections to order. I now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the amendment that I spoke about when Dr. Babin introduced his proposed amendment a few minutes ago. And this really continues the substance of what he was intending. And I offer this amendment to support his work and continue our partnership together on the use and integration of commercial space and airborne data in agency activities. As I discussed earlier, there are concerns about his previous amendment as written, which is overly prescriptive. So I offered this alternative amendment, which addressed the core of his prior amendment to support the purchase of commercial satellite and airborne data at both NOAA and NASA, and insert additional considerations for commercial data purchases in the bill. While I know the text of my amendment was just distributed to the members this morning, this text was discussed at length between majority and minority staffs yesterday. I believe all members should support this alternative to further improve the bill and ensure relevant and appropriate commercial data sources can support our nation's wildland firefighting enterprise we're enhancing through the legislation today. And I know I probably speak for Representative Lofgren, although she can speak for herself, and myself, Ms. Ross. I would say that Dr. Babin, as this bill moves forward, would like to continue to work with you on this subject. My main point here is the United States is the customer, and I want the customer to have as many choices as possible. And I felt his amendment was too prescriptive initial iteration. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And I yield to Ms. Lofgren. Yes.
I just want to say thank you for offering this amendment. I think, well, Dr. Babin can speak for himself, but I think it accomplishes what he wants to accomplish. It certainly accomplishes what I'd like to accomplish without being prescriptive. I think it's helpful, and I support the amendment. I yield back to the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, and I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Yes, I would like to have a make
Chair,
a statement here as well.
Mr. Babin. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I appreciate my colleagues' efforts to work with me to strengthen the bill. As I said earlier, and as it stands, the underlying bill still does very little to address the challenge posed by wildfires. It simply reinforces the status quo, but this inaction comes with a cost. There's a missed opportunity to greatly assist civil agencies as well as state, local, and tribal entities. It could provide scientists, emergency coordinators, and first responders with timely, actionable, existing data on wildfires that is rapidly shareable and reflects the state of the art, not the state of the past. Mr. Perlmutter's amendment heavily waters down the original amendment to the point of undermining the very intent to enable the expanded use of commercial remote sensing capabilities to address wildfires. Commercial solutions, private partnerships, and data buys have been recommended in numerous policies and laws for many years. The 2007 and 2018 Earth Science Decadal Reviews call for expansion of these efforts, and so does the 2014 and 2019 National Plans for Civil Earth Observations. U.S. law also directs the prioritization of commercial remote sensing data acquisition. My amendment has the support of commercial remote sensing companies. It would benefit the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. government, state, local, and tribal entities, U.S. industry, and our overall wildfire enterprise. And I hope the gentleman will work with me in the future to strengthen this provision as we go forward. With that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Excuse me. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Further proceedings on this amendment. Oops. I'll do it. There are no pending amendments.
So just like we're going to move on to the next bill, and we'll take votes on that previous bill later.
Okay. We will postpone taking the vote on this bill and move to the next one. H.R. 1437 will be considered. The clerk will report the amendment. Report the bill.
H.R. 1437, a bill to amend the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act of 2017 to direct the national.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does anyone wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Ms. Cheryl.
Who is it?
Ms. Cheryl.
Mikey Sherrill.
Oh, Ms. Cheryl, you're recognized.
Thank you. A couple of months ago, Hurricane Ida, which made landfall over 1,000 miles away, caused historic and deadly levels of rainfall and flooding across my district in New Jersey. In fact, according to CDC estimates, over 35% of the deaths related to Hurricane Ida were in New Jersey, the largest share of deaths in any state. The storm also upended transportation across my state, temporarily shutting down Newark International Airport with nearly 400 flights canceled and an entire terminal closed. New Jersey Transit rail service was almost entirely suspended except for the Atlantic City rail line, while buses were delayed across the state as they encountered roads closed by flooding and downed trees. But it's not just Hurricane Ida. Climate change is causing all storms to rapidly intensify, increasing flood risk and putting New Jersey further at risk. Extreme weather events like Ida highlight the ever-growing need for improvements in our ability to forecast and predict heavy rainfall and associated flooding. We've known the dangers of storms in New Jersey for decades, and the data proves they are getting worse as the years go on. 6 people were drowned in New Jersey during Hurricane Florida in 1999, including a resident of Passaic County, which I represent. In 2011, 9 people in New Jersey died from Hurricane Irene, most from drowning in the raging flood waters while trapped inside their cars. And at least 40 people from New Jersey died during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. We've got to do better. We previously heard about the need for improved precipitation data to inform flood maps and management decisions at a subcommittee hearing I chaired in February of 2020 on flood science and flood maps. Much of the precipitation data we have for regions across the U.S. are decades old and do not account for changes in precipitation frequency and severity due to climate change. NOAA is responsible for updating precipitation frequency estimates and probable maximum precipitation estimates. Updated precipitation data is critical for informing flood risk for flood-prone areas. For my home state of New Jersey, the last major update to the Atlas 14 precipitation data was in 2006. And before that, it was in 1977. We cannot afford to wait 30 years between updates. Climate change demands we be more proactive about our data collection and move from this once-in-a-generation update approach. Based on the resounding need for more up-to-date, accurate precipitation data from many parts of the nation, I wrote the Providing Research and Estimates of Change in Precipitation, or PRECIP Act. This bill would mandate NOAA periodically update precipitation studies for all regions and territories of the U.S. to ensure complete coverage. As climate change continues to increase the frequency and intensity of flooding events in the U.S. and the number of heavy precipitation events, it's essential that communities in my district like Little Falls, Woodland Park, and Denville have the best information possible now and in the future. It's important to note that this bill is not just about numbers and estimates on a spreadsheet inside a government agency. Ensuring this data is accurate and up to date is about health, safety, and well-being in our communities as they confront these ever increasingly dangerous storms. Unfortunately, as my community knows far too well, this issue can be life or death. I'm grateful to Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, Ranking Member Bice, and several other members of this committee for co-sponsoring this legislation. I'm also pleased that this bill has bipartisan support in the Senate, where Senator Booker has introduced the companion bill with Senator Wicker. I am also grateful to over a dozen organizations that have expressed their support for this bill. These organizations represent a wide range of stakeholder groups, including scientists, floodplain managers, and engineers. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a list of endorsing 8 organizations and a letter of support from the American Geophysical Union.
Thank you very much. Any requests for time?
Madam Chair, Suzanne Bonamici.
Ms. Bonamici is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to speak in support of Representative Sherrill's piece of bipartisan legislation. I'm from Oregon, and of course, people have the understanding that it rains a lot in Oregon. However, we just experienced something called atmospheric river. It was a deluge of rain in so many places in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington State, just to the north, 170,000 people lost power. On the Pacific Northwest coast in Oregon, the Coast Guard had to help people evacuate from flooded areas. And the more information, the more data we can get ahead of time, the more accurate the forecast can be, and the more we can do to protect lives and property. At the same time, we don't have a lot of snowpack, and we're still in some parts of the state experiencing drought, which is, of course, related to the climate crisis. But today, thank you to Representative Sherrill and the co-sponsors of this important legislation, which I strongly support. And thank you again, and I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I yield to Representative Walker.
I just wanted to join in thanking Ms. Sherrill. You know, California is in a huge drought right now, but what we've discovered is that when it does rain, it's enormous. These atmospheric rivers and the flooding that occurs is really something very different than we have experienced in the past. So this legislation is very important to the state of California, even though we're suffering from drought. When we see a couple of pieces of water in the air, we wonder what it is, and then we find out it's a flood. So thank you very much for your leadership on this. It's really important.
I yield back the balance. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. And I want to thank the Chairwoman of the Environment Subcommittee, Representative Sherrill, for introducing this legislation and working with my staff and me to reach a bipartisan product. In one of our first committee hearings this Congress, we discussed this bill along with the idea of a federal climate service. I'm pleased to see that my colleagues have heeded my caution against increasing federal bureaucracy by establishing new services and instead have focused on what we know works, enabling our established agencies to collect and acquire the data they need to be successful. The PRECIP Act does that by authorizing NOAA to update its precipitation frequency estimates, begin a National Academy study on precipitation estimate research needs, and develop a plan to update probable maximum precipitation estimates. This information is absolutely critical to farmers and ranchers of Oklahoma. Both historic data and future estimates of precipitation, it doesn't rain often enough in Oklahoma either on the west side, can inform the agricultural industry of growing season length, plant survival in specific areas, and irrigation needs for the season. These are all necessary to continue providing our country with a food security. Additionally, we cannot forget the value of partnerships between the public and private sectors when it comes to weather data collection. There is no need for NOAA to go out and collect what is already available, and I'm pleased to see this bill considers the value of private sector precipitation information. It seems fitting that public-private partnerships were a prominent feature of my bill, the Weather Act of 2017, and the legislation before us today now amends that law with a similar message. I want to thank Chairwoman Sherrill for going through the normal committee process and working in a bipartisan manner to accomplish this bill. And I'm proud to co-sponsor it with her and look forward to its passage. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other requests for time?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Ms. Ross.
Ms. Ross is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also am thrilled to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 1437, the Protect Communities from Increased Precipitation and Climate Change Act. This legislation will provide consistent funding for NOAA to update out-of-date precipitation data. My home state of North Carolina is particularly susceptible to extreme weather like hurricanes. Over 350 North Carolinians live in flood-prone areas, and flooding occurs every 7.6 days on average in my state. Inaccurate precipitation data can be the difference between life and death for North Carolinians in flood-prone areas. These rainfall standards have also historically been used to regulate and design high-hazard potential infrastructure, including dams. Inaccurate or outdated reporting could impact our ability to safely invest in climate-resilient infrastructure. I would like to thank Chairwoman Cheryl for her leadership on this important topic, and I look forward to working with her to see this bill get over the finish line. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1437, offered by Ms. Cheryl.
Cheryl, you recognize to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This amendment in the nature of a substitute of the PRECIP Act makes a few small changes to provide further clarity on the activities in this bill and to better align with the Senate companion introduced by my fellow New Jerseyan Senator Booker and co-led by Senator Wicker of Mississippi. I'm so proud that this bill has bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. And when I look at the House colleagues that have stood up to co-sponsor this bill, I can see that they come from a diverse array of communities from across our country, emphasizing how important the issue of flooding and weather disasters are. I noted Hurricane Ida in my earlier remarks and how, despite making landfall in Louisiana on August 29th, killed 32 people in my state after making its way days later. But what I did not mention was that 28 of those individuals, nearly 88%, drowned from floods caused by the increased precipitation. Many of these deaths could and should have been prevented with more accurate storm and flood warnings that come further in advance. I'm sure we all wish we could say that this type of destruction and death should be rare, an unexpected anomaly that should only occur once in a century or more. Unfortunately, the data tells us otherwise. Of the top 10 costliest hurricanes to hit the United States, all but one occurred within the last 20 years, and 4 of those 10 occurred since 2017. Estimated cost of hurricane damage from the past 10 years is over $570 billion, just hurricanes, with much of that damage relating to flooding and that it's tied to extreme precipitation. So thank you so much. There isn't a member of this committee who hasn't heard from their constituents about the effect of disasters like these. For my constituents in Pequannock and Fairfield and Morristown and Lincoln Park and Montville and Verona and in too many other towns to name in my allotted time, this is a critical and pressing issue. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment? We will now vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum now being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 1437
Just let me know.
as amendment to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion is to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. All members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on this measure. We now will consider H.R. 5324, the NWR Weather Radio Modernization Act of 2021. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5324, a bill to provide guidance for an investment in the upgrade and modernization of the National Oceanic and
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does anyone wish to be recognized to speak on the underlying bill?
Madam Chairwoman, I do.
Ms. Bice is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, and thank you to my colleague on the Environment Subcommittee, Chairwoman Sherrill, for co-sponsoring this bill with me. The NOAA Weather Radio All Hazards, known as NWR, is a highly successful nationwide network of stations that broadcasts natural, environmental, and public safety alerts. Simply put, NWR is the single source for comprehensive weather and emergency information. That's because it consists of more than 1,000 stations broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to 95% of the population. Like many of my constituents in Oklahoma, I have a receiver in my home, and I can tell you it's nearly impossible to sleep through it or ignore its loud alerts, especially during tornado season in Oklahoma. The devices themselves are inexpensive, around $20 in the most basic form, and can operate where cell coverage is limited or completely lost, which is likely in the midst of any major disaster. But they have limitations. Receivers must be within 40 miles of a transmitter, and terrain or building interference can reduce that radius. Additionally, the NWR network last received upgrades to its capabilities in the late 1990s. Since that time, operations and maintenance costs have increased and technology has greatly advanced. As the world becomes more digitized, we must ensure that the protection of life and property doesn't get lost in the shuffle. That is why I introduced this legislation. The NWR is consistent and trusted as a result of saving numerous lives, but it needs to be upgraded and modernized to remain effective for the future. My bill, H.R. 5324, authorizes upgrades to the existing system through timely repairs to broadcast transmitter sites and antennas. This will ensure that reliable systems in place are not abandoned and outages become less common. This legislation also enables a modernization initiative for broadcast to transmit to IP-based communications and develop options for backup capabilities to enhance signal transmission. This paves the way for the future and provides fail-safe options so that NWR is never down for an extended period of time. Last but not least, my bill requires NOAA to assess NWR access. This will ensure that these modernization efforts are successful and that people across the country have easy, reliable access in a manner that is in line with modern technology. While covering 95% of the population is great, we should always strive for 100% equal access. The 3 main tenets of my bill put us on a path to achieving that very goal. The benefits of NWR are numerous. The signal can easily reach and educate vulnerable communities. It can cover both land and marine warnings. And when a disaster is over, NWR can issue an all clear for a community that might be battered, but whose people are safe. I want to again thank Chairwoman Sherrill for co-sponsoring this bill, working in a bipartisan manner to perfect it, and helping bring this valuable service into the 21st century. I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Sherrill is recognized.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm pleased that we're also advancing the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act today. I was happy to work on a bipartisan basis with Ranking Member Bice on this important legislation and on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. NOAA Weather Radio provides continuous coverage of weather information and broadcasts National Weather Service warnings, watches, and forecasts. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts warning and post-event information for other hazards like national disasters, environmental hazards, or public safety alerts. This bill will expand coverage of NOAA Weather Radio by directing the NOAA administrator to acquire additional transmitters to ensure that underserved communities are within range. It also directs NOAA to update related telecommunications infrastructure and software so that Americans across the country, no matter their circumstances, can be prepared for severe weather events and authorizes funding to support these activities. Ensuring our communities have the best information possible about impending storms before, during, and after they hit is critical to making sure that they have what they need to make it through safely. Thank you so much. Thank you to Ranking Member Bice, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lucas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. I also want to thank the ranking member of the Environmental Subcommittee and my esteemed colleague from Oklahoma, Representative Bice, for introducing this legislation. Just last month, Oklahoma broke its previous record for the number of tornadoes in a single month, with 28 confirmed touchdowns. We had more tornadoes than the rest of the year combined. But there's a bright side to this story. There were 0 deaths resulting from these storms. This is due in large part to the prediction capacities and advanced warning systems we have in place. The NOAA Weather Radio is one of the most prominent among them. It is undeniable that NWR saves lives, day or night, power or no power, in a rural area or in the heart of a city. NWR device will loudly alert you and your family to severe weather is on its way. Oklahomans have grown up listening to these announcements. We take them seriously and we act on them. That saves lives. But some areas, especially those with extreme terrain or densely packed buildings, do not have the same widespread access to NOAA's weather radio because of interference. Our ultimate goal should be for all U.S. citizens to have unimpeded access to the life-saving alerts this system provides. That's why I am fully supportive of Representative Bice's legislation to expand and modernize the NOAA Weather Radio. In addition to access needs, aging infrastructure has led to increased maintenance costs and more weather radio outages. The copper wiring that connects broadcast transmitters to weather service stations is becoming obsolete and expensive. And more powerful storms require backup options and stronger signals in case of extensive damage to mission-critical facilities. This bill addresses all of those concerns and sets up the NWR to be just as useful in the 21st century as it has been since 1975, when it was designated the sole government provider of direct warning to private homes. I want to again thank the leadership of the Environmental Subcommittee, Ranking Member Bice, and Chairwoman Sherrill for leading on this critical issue. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We now will proceed with the amendments in order of the roster.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The first amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentle lady from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice, and you are now recognized to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This amendment, in the nature of a substitute, makes minor changes based.
Report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5324, offered by Ms. Bice.
Madam, consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentle lady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes minor changes based on feedback from NOAA and the NWR program. One change I am particularly happy to see is the addition of language tasking the NOAA administrator with acquiring additional broadcast transmitters. This is focused on reaching that last 5% of the U.S. population that is currently outside of the NWR coverage. This is largely extreme rural land and land adjacent to national parks or recreation areas. But the addition also includes underserved communities that might lack a single transmitter in the area. Based on our conversations with NOAA, this is a welcome addition and makes this most effective legislation possible. I want to again highlight the bipartisan process that led to this bill being marked up today and thank Chairwoman Sherrill and committee staff for their willingness to negotiate the language. I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time. I yield back.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the amendment? If there are no additional comments, we will move to the next amendment and vote on the substitute later. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, you're recognized to offer your amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5324, offered by Mr.
Unanimous
Posey.
consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This amendment amends 2 parts of the bill. The first part will make sure NOAA includes commercial partners when they develop options concerning satellite backup capability for NOAA weather radio. This will help ensure a continuity of the radio service during extreme weather events. The second part addresses the electromagnetic pulse or geomagnetic disturbance concerns. It will require an assessment and provide recommendations on the potential effects of an electromagnetic pulse or a geomagnetic disturbance on the NOAA weather radio. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. We will now vote on the amendments in the nature of a substitute as amended. The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 5324 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
Chairman, I had a question for Mr. Finley. Different technologies have.
Is that
It's fine.
the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, shall order. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure.
3-minute recess. Taking a 3-minute recess.
You know, we're going to take a 5-minute recess and come back and finish up with our votes. We've gotten word that we have time for anyone who has votes on financial services. It's been delayed for a few minutes. 5-minute break. Garcia amendment as we come back to order. And I would ask that members please state their name first when responding to the roll. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren?
Lofgren, no.
Ms. Lofgren, no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici? Mr. Barra?
Barra, no.
Mr. Barrett, no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens?
Yep, here. No. No, I'm a no.
Ms. Stevens, no.
Yep, sorry.
Miss Cheryl?
No.
Ms. Cheryl, no. Mr. Bowman? Mr. Bowman? Ms. Stansberry?
Stansberry is a no.
Ms. Stansberry, no. Mr. Sherman?
No.
Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. McNerney?
McNerney votes no.
Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Foster?
Foster, no.
Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Norcross?
Norcross, no.
Mr. Norcross, no. Mr. Byer?
Fire, no.
Mr. Byer, no. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris? Mr. Tonko?
Taco's a no.
Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Caston?
Caston, no.
Mr. Caston, no. Mr. Lamb?
Lamb, no.
Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross, no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee, no. Ms. Wild?
Wild votes no.
Ms. Wild, no. Ms. Fletcher?
Fletcher votes no.
Ms. Fletcher, no. Mr. Lucas?
Lucas votes yes.
Mr. Lucas, yes. Mr. Brooks?
Yes.
Mr. Brooks, yes. Mr. Posey?
Posey, yes.
Mr. Posey, yes. Mr. Weber?
Weber votes yes.
Mr. Weber, yes. Mr. Babin?
Babin, yes.
Mr. Babin, yes. Mr. Gonzalez?
Yes.
Mr. Gonzalez, yes. Mr. Waltz?
Waltz votes yes.
Mr. Waltz, yes. Mr. Baird?
Baird votes yes.
Mr. Baird, yes. Mr. Webster?
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster, yay. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes yes.
Mr. Garcia, yes. Ms. Bice?
Ms. Bice is yes.
Ms. Bice, yes. Ms. Kim?
Kim is a yes.
Ms. Kim, yes. Mr. Feenstra?
Feenstra is yes.
Mr. Feenstra, yes. Mr. LaTurner?
LaTurner is yes.
Mr. LaTurner, yes. Mr. Jimenez? Mr. Jimenez? Mr. Abernathy?
Obernolte, yes.
Mr. Abernathy, yes. Mr. Meyer? Mr. Meyer?
Fire is a yes.
Meyer? Mr. Meyer? Mr. Elzey?
LZI.
Mr. Elzey, aye. Ms. Bonamici?
Bonamici votes no.
Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Bowman?
Mr. Bowman votes no.
Mr. Bowman, no. Mr. Jimenez? Mr. Jimenez? Mr. Meyer?
Recognition from the chair. Chris votes no.
Any other persons want to record their votes?
Make sure Mr. Chris does. Because the
Meyer, what's your vote, Mr. Meyer?
I don't think they heard us. Madam Chair, I wanted to make sure I recorded my vote.
Mr. Chris is recognized.
Thank you. Chris votes no. Thank
Mr.
you, Madam
Chris?
Chair.
Mr. Chris, no.
Anyone else wishing to be recorded?
Hi, this is Representative Jimenez. I vote no.
Any members not recorded yet?
Madam Chair, how's Norcross recorded?
Madam Clerk?
Norcross voted no.
Thank you.
Any member not recorded or would like to change their vote?
Madam Chairwoman?
Yes.
Yes, this is Representative Jimenez. Did you record my no vote?
Mr. Jimenez, no.
Jimenez votes no.
Madam Chair, this is Don Byer. Asking how my vote has been recorded. I think I was voting for Mr. Meyer at the same time.
Okay. Would the clerk report on that on Mr. Meyer's question? Byers' question.
Mr. Byer, you voted no.
Thank you.
Anyone else needs to be recorded? The clerk will report.
next one. So, yeah.
The noes are 24, the yeas are 16.
The amendment is not adopted. We now go to the question on the Babin amendment. And I'd like to ask members, please state their name first when responding to the roll. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairwoman Johnson?
No.
Chairwoman Johnson, no. Ms. Lofgren?
Lofgren, no.
Ms. Lofgren, no. Ms. Bonamici?
Bonamici votes no.
Ms. Bonamici, no. Mr. Barra?
Barra votes no.
Mr. Barra, no. Ms. Stevens?
Stevens votes no.
Ms. Stevens, no. Ms. Sherrill?
No.
Ms. Sherrill, no. Mr. Bowman?
Mr. Bowman votes no.
Mr. Bowman, no. Ms. Stansberry?
Stansberry, no.
Ms. Stansberry, no. Mr. Sherman?
No.
Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Perlmutter?
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. McNerney?
McNerney votes no.
Mr. McNerney, no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Foster?
Foster, no.
Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Norcross?
Norcross votes no.
Mr. Norcross, no. Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer? Mr. Christ?
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer? No. Mr. Christ?
Chris votes no.
Mr. Christ? No. Mr. Caston?
Gaston votes no.
Mr. Caston, no. Mr. Lamb?
Lamb, no.
Mr. Lamb, no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross, no. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee, no. Ms. Wild?
Wild votes no.
Ms. Wild, no. Ms. Fletcher? Ms. Fletcher?
Fletcher votes no.
Ms. Fletcher, no. Mr. Lucas?
Lucas votes yes.
Mr. Lucas, yes. Mr. Brooks?
Yes.
Mr. Brooks, yes. Mr. Posey?
Posey, yes.
Mr. Posey, yes. Mr. Weber?
Weber votes yes.
Mr. Weber, yes. Mr. Babin?
Babin, yes.
Mr. Babin, yes. Mr. Gonzalez?
Gonzalez, yes.
Mr. Gonzalez, yes. Mr. Waltz? Mr. Waltz?
Waltz votes yes.
Mr. Waltz, yes. Mr. Baird?
Baird, yes.
Mr. Baird, yes. Mr. Webster?
Webster votes yay.
Mr. Webster, yay. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia, yay.
Mr. Garcia, yay. Ms. Bice?
Miss Bice, yay.
Ms. Bice, yay. Ms. Kim?
Kim is yes.
Ms. Kim, yes. Mr. Feenstra?
Feenstra, aye.
Mr. Feenstra, aye. Mr. LaTurner?
LaTurner, aye.
Mr. LaTurner, aye. Mr. Jimenez?
Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez, aye. Mr. Obernolte?
Obernolte, aye.
Mr. Obernolte, aye. Mr. Meyer? Mr. Meyer? Mr. Elzey?
LZ, aye.
Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Tonko?
Tacos, no.
Mr. Tonko, no. Mr. Meyer? Mr. Meyer?
Any members not recorded? Any members like to change their vote? The clerk will report.
Chairwoman Johnson, the noes are 23, the yeas are 17.
The amendment is not adopted. Now we'll vote on amendment in the nature of a substitute. As amended, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If someone needs to move. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 5781 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify by saying no.
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 The ayes have it, and the bill is
No.
favorable.
Keep going.
The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views to the measure. I want to thank all members for their cooperation of being present and active today. This concludes our markup, and I thank all of you for participating. We're in adjournment.